So good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's SEAMS workshop. I'm Joanne Serena, Vice President of Stakeholder Engagement and Customer Experience at the California ISO. I would really like to thank Seattle City Light for hosting us here at Seattle City Hall, a beautiful location. And thank you to all of you for taking the time to join us, especially those that I know had to travel from afar. We also have a large group of virtual attendees, so really appreciate everybody joining us in person and online. I think we have close to 100 folks that are going to be joining us virtually and similar numbers here in person. So really appreciate all of you coming together. This level of participation really reflects the importance of today's conversation and the shared commitment across the West to understand and address the opportunities and challenges that we all face ahead. So we spent a lot of time at the ISO thinking about what was the best way, to bring everybody together and work on this topic. So today marks the start of a new 4-part workshop series focused on market-to-market SEAMS across the region. So as the Western markets landscape continues to evolve, it's important that we come together, we share our perspectives, learn from one another, and build a common understanding of the issues that are going to face us. So we do recognize, and we talked quite a bit about this as we sort of made up these workshops, that we have a very diverse set of viewpoints on these topics, and we really view that as a strength that we hope these workshops are going to harness. And the progress really depends on the open dialogue, the thoughtful engagement, and willingness to work across organizations. And I know I was talking to Todd earlier, it's great to see so much different representation across the board, from balancing authorities, market operators, market participants, regulators, transmission owners, utilities, and stakeholders throughout the West, and it's going to take all of us to sort of navigate these changes together. So today's workshop is designed to foster that collaboration. So we'll bring throughout the day today, we'll bring a group of folks together, distinguished experts, including representatives from FERC, industry thought leaders, and regulators from across the region. So thank you to our speakers that are going to sort of bring this topic to life and bring your perspectives and share with everybody today. So we do hope that this is going to foster a lot of dialogue today and in the coming months. So we look forward to your input and certainly hope that you're going to participate and ask a lot of questions at today's workshop and also through the feedback opportunities after the workshop. So thank you again for being here, your willingness to engage in these important topics and discussions. And we're looking forward to a productive session today and in the months ahead. So now I'm going to turn it over to Paul Dockery. He's our Market Strategy and Governance Manager, and he's going to kick things off and give an overview and sort of talk about the details of each of the workshops. Thanks.
Yeah. You want to do it?
Before we turn it over to Paul, I'm going to go over some quick housekeeping. Thanks, Joanne and Paul. Hi, everyone. Good morning. My name is Christina Guimera, representing CAISO Stakeholder Affairs. I'll be helping to facilitate some of our online questions that we received today. So just a few quick reminders. Today's call is being recorded for informational and convenience purposes only. Any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. As a reminder, this slide deck is posted online on the Market SEAMS webpage, and the recording will be posted there soon as well. This meeting is really intended to stimulate open dialogue. We'll pause periodically throughout the panel presentations, and the moderators will let you know when those question portions will happen. Please keep your comments professional and respectful today. And for when you have questions in the room, a good rule of thumb is to prop your name placard up so we know you have a question. And then for those of you online, you can raise your hand on the bottom right hand of your screen. And for those of you online as well, you can access closed captioning on the bottom left hand of your screen. And we also have the Inteller Transparency Viewer on the bottom right hand of your screen. So be sure to refresh that prior to viewing. And next slide, please. And again, for the raising your hand, bottom of your right hand. And if you joined audio only online, please press *3 on your device. And if you're having trouble with the raise hand feature, you can always send in your questions via chat. And if you have any problems at any time, please reach out to the event producer and Inteller Events. So with that, I will turn things over to Paul Dockery, Market Strategy and Governance Manager at CAISO. We could perfect that slide.
Thanks, Christina, and thanks, Joanne, and thanks everybody for being here. As Joanne said, I think it does represent how important this topic is to the West and our interest in making sure we maintain reliability across the region. If you go to the next slide, please. As Joanne and as Christina said, I'm a Market Strategy and Governance Manager at the California ISO, and I'm also part of a cross-functional team that's been working on SEAMS issues. And we tried to build out an agenda and a workshop series that addresses the complexity of the issue, starting from understanding the issues at hand, and then driving to kind of the specific technical discussion in the series. So we did set this whole workshop series up to get more technical as we went along. Today we get to some of the framing around the key issues from the experts and then the panel discussion. I have 20 minutes at the top to frame up some of these issues, including some differentiation and distinctions around SEAMS, understanding and some context about what the Western map looks like under different market configurations. And then we're going to talk through the order that requires a joint report from SPP and CAISO, and how that maps to the workshop series we have planned for August, September, and October. Next slide. So in this first section, I'm going to go do three things. I'm going to do just some clarification of terms. I think that can be helpful to start with. I'm going to provide the list of SEAMS principles that we published on our website. And then, as I mentioned, I'm a visual learner, and I have a map that I think sometimes can help what we mean by these market SEAMS and the topic of the workshop series. If you go to the next slide. So SEAMS definitions, I think generally, we understand SEAMS as these interfaces between wholesale market functions. I like to think of them and differentiate the interfaces from the issues that they cause. So on the wholesale electric grid, we have these interfaces between balancing authorities, transmission providers, reliability coordinators. And then there are some issues that arise that require coordination. We work on a network, and it was both operating on the network. It does require us to coordinate when we perform some functions. So those are SEAMS generally. I think it is helpful, especially in the Western context, to differentiate between the general SEAMS and market SEAMS. In the Eastern context, the balancing authorities, transmission service functions, reliability functions were generally consolidated. In the West, that is different. And so the boundaries associated with market SEAMS can be different than SEAMS generally, and the SEAMS between balancing authorities. So for purposes of differentiating terms, I think of market SEAMS as those interfaces between where we use security constrained economic dispatch, similar to the boundaries that exist today between the Western Energy Imbalance Market and RTO expansion in the eastern side of the Western interconnection. And then the market SEAMS issues are where there are interference that arise because of those two security constrained economic dispatches on the network. And issues that arise, you can learn, there's been lots of reports and lots of documentation of issues related to market seams in the East, you get things like dispatch interference, inefficient congestion management, and suboptimal dispatch. Those are the type of issues we're trying to address in market seams. To go to the next slide. One of the lessons as we were approaching this topic was a lesson from the Eastern markets about the importance of principles, establishing what you're working on. So we developed this set of 8 principles. Our themes are reliability, respect, and mutual benefits. And we are happy to take comments on this set of principles as part of this series, and we'll go into later on the various mechanisms and tools for comments after this workshop. I will say it's nice that SPP put out a set of principles, and there's great alignment between these sets that the ISO has and SPP has. We're both focused on reliability, efficiency, and fairness. I'm not going to go through each of the 8 principles, but there's 3 of them I thought may be helpful to call out and provide more context. And if you go to the link, and if you go to the SEAMS website on the Western Energy Markets webpage, there's additional context for each of these you can read. The first one is respecting the autonomy of our partners. So Western markets, especially the WEIM and the extended day-ahead market, are designed to allow balancing authorities and transmission service providers to self-determine when, how, and to what extent to participate in organized markets. That framework means that transmission operators and balancing authority functions are not consolidated in a single footprint, and participating entities retain reliability responsibilities. So appropriately scoping these SEAMS discussions and agreements based on the specific issues is critical, given the many different business models, jurisdictions, entities that the Western markets cover. It's just important to acknowledge that distinction from the East to the West. And that's what we're trying to do with this principle. Second one I wanted to highlight is that SEAMS arrangements should benefit both markets. So each market has its own rules approved by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to manage imports, exports, and congestion. The coordination between these distinct platforms will require the investment in time and resources. And those costs need to be outweighed by improvements to reliability and affordability outcomes for each market footprint compared to operating under its standalone rules. And the third is the principle that SEAMS discussions are not a forum for market design advocacy. The FERC order actually uses similar language in its request for comments on the joint report, noting that responsive comments should be limited to SEAMS management and market coordination efforts in the joint report and should not seek to revisit underlying market design decisions. And for purposes of our principle, we want SEAMS discussions to be solution-oriented. The principle does not mean that the ISO is not open to modifying market rules and going through processes and initiatives to change rules to make things more efficient. We're just focused on, for this purpose and for this forum, that we don't use it for market design advocacy. We look for solutions to the SEAMS issues. Those were both walls of text and slide. And the next one, we transition to the visual representation. I'm just like I mentioned, a visual learner. I think a map helps me understand what I'm actually talking about. So when we talk about market SEAMS, we are thinking about the interfaces between these markets, not just within one. So it does require the map to have the jurisdictions across the West. In this stage of 2027, there are entities joining the extended day-ahead market. There is the Western Energy Imbalance Market, and then there is the Markets Plus footprint, and some entities moving between the Western Energy Imbalance Market and Markets Plus. The Western Interconnect is intertwined. It helps, I think, to put in context what we talk about when we're talking about market SEAMS. That we're talking about for purposes of our discussions, these interactions between these market footprints, which is dependent on configuration. So if you move to the next slide, as I mentioned, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission issued an order for a joint report since this series was scheduled. So we did modify this section to try to link the workshop series that we had planned to the areas in the report that we'll be jointly working on with SPP to be responsive to. So if you go to the next slide, this is the general series. So in July, we're here talking about and getting input from regulators and subject matter experts on the key issues and the interests across the region. As I mentioned, we're getting more technical as we progress through the series. So in August, we will be talking about the reliability aspects of transmission constraints and congestion management. In September, we're going to talk about the cross-border transactions, imports and exports. And then in September 30th, we have a report due. And then in October, we have another scheduled. And as part of comments, we are open to topics that you all find interesting that we should be covering in October. If you go to the next slide, wanted to just, because it is was from a week and a half ago, July 16th, thought it would be helpful to lay out the questions of that order that we will be working on with SPP. So I think of these questions in three areas, categorize them in three types. The first is just the status of the coordination across the Western Interconnection and the status of discussions with SPP. The second is, in my mind, issue identification. So understanding how the market rules will deal with some of these issues related to scheduling related just to scheduling and transmission use, related to congestion management, and related to loop flow. The third question is around the plan, so how the joint parties are thinking about addressing this and the schedule for addressing it. And then lastly, the category of issues where we have not come to a resolution, where there's still a gap between us. And for purposes of this workshop series, if you go to the next slide, I think we are covering a lot of these topics in August and September, so that the category of issue identification on congestion management and loop flows relates closely to the plan for the next workshop series, where we're talking about, and we'll have experts that from the transmission operations and engineering talking about how we study the system in advance of the market runs, how transmission operators and planners think about it, and then how congestion management is done with market tools. And we are working with and are appreciative of the Southwest Power Pool for participating in those panels, especially as we think about market seams. They're very market dependent. I'm not a subject matter expert on SPP's market design, and the ISO doesn't want to speak for them. So having them there, presenting with them, having transmission engineers from the transmission operator functions, I think will be very beneficial as we talk about both loop flow aspects, congestion management, and really the reliability aspects of seams. We'll also, in those workshops, try to build some examples. So the purpose of these is try to make sure that the engineers understand the economics and the economists understand the engineering related to seams, so that people that are participating in the policy discussions from across the region have a good understanding of the issues at hand. If you go to the next slide. The September workshop is planned to talk about imports and exports and transactions across market boundaries. That relates nicely to question 2, A and C, where we're talking about scheduling, reservations, transmission rights, and again on loop flow. I think loop flow contributes to a lot of these issues, and both of these discussions have to address that. So again, we're trying to build up from across the Western Interconnection to experts and get insights about how it happens today. We're looking for participants to talk about cross-border trade. And then we will again are working with the Southwest Power Pool to make sure we have subject matter experts from both the ISO and SPP to talk about the market protocol, how those work under the as-approved designs today, and then build on some examples for how that works, and making sure we have try to be clear about how those rules can impact trade in the region. If you go to the next slide. So the October workshop series, as I mentioned, we've been holding that for topics that participants throughout think are missed in the other two, or we may benefit from more time for. It also was intended to include a discussion of the plan and schedule for addressing the issues, and that maps nicely to question 3 in the order that asks for a joint plan and schedule from the Southwest Power Pool and the ISO. So I think that maps nicely. It's a good opportunity to continue the discussions. These are not meant to be just a series of 4, but ultimately lead into how we're going to coordinate between the Southwest Power Pool and the ISO, and also across the balancing authorities and transmission operators in the region. So you go to the next slide. As I mentioned, there is a comment period. We'll continue. You can go to the registration site for their meeting page for this to get links to where to supply the comments and the instructions for doing it. Our next workshop, we did extend. This is today, obviously, is from 9 to noon. The next one, as we get into more technical discussions, we're going to take up more time. That is planned for 9 to 2:30. And the Western Electricity Coordinating Council's offices in Salt Lake City, please go register. And as I mentioned, we have a SEAMS webpage on the Western Energy Market website where we'll continue to provide information on the workshop series as well as notes from the discussions. So with that, that's my share of the agenda, where we're trying to set up the workshop series and provide context for why we're addressing them. We again think these are, our approach to these are understanding the issues and then understanding the mechanisms to mitigate them. And we'll get more insights from our subject matter experts the rest of today, as well as the interests on these issues from our panel of state regulators. And if you have any other feedback, happy to hear it. That is the end of me.
Thanks, Paul. Next, we're going to hear from an expert panel. We have as our moderator, Kavya Niranjan, and our panelists are Bob Helrick Dawson, John Tsoukalis, and Richard Doying.
Press. Hello. All right.
Shall I test this one too? This one sounds okay.
That's what sounds better.
All right. I think I'll get us. Shall I start? Is that okay? Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Kavya Niranjan. I'm the Markets and Transmission Policy Manager at Renewable Northwest. I'm based here in Seattle, so welcome. You couldn't have picked a better weekend to be here. Renewable Northwest is a clean energy policy and advocacy organization. Our membership is a healthy mix of clean energy developers, environmental and public interest organizations, law firms, engineering consultants. So almost anyone that touches clean energy is a member of ours, and we benefit from that diversity. I'm also the public interest sector liaison to CAISO's Regional Issues Forum. And I'm also a rostered member of the Markets Plus Participant Executive Committee, the Design Working Group, and the Interim Governance Task Force. All of that to say, I live in this world. I live in markets, and I'm really excited to see meetings like this one come together and to see the faces in the room that would otherwise be in separate rooms in the same room together. So thanks. And thanks to Paul in particular, but to the CAISO for hosting this here, and I'll get us started. The goal of this, the first of two panels today, is twofold. The first goal is really to dive deeper into some of the technical challenges and solutions around market seams, those that are available to us, and also to compare and contrast with experiences and lessons learned from the East. Just to preview the format a little bit, we'll have about 15 minutes of presentation from each of our speakers. We'll save about 10 minutes after each speaker for discussion amongst the panelists. That might be a good time, if there is time, for some clarifying questions from the audience, recognizing we have people in the room, but people virtually as well. But I think what we'll try to do is save any meatier audience questions for the end of all three presentations, just so everyone has a chance to present. Okay, I will introduce our three speakers. First and foremost, we have Bob Hellrick-Dawson from the Office of Energy Market Regulation at FERC, focused on the West. He'll help us frame the discussion a bit more and touch on FERC's increasingly active engagement on Western markets. After that, we'll have John Tsoukalis of Brattle Group fame. He's worked on several of the key market participation and benefits analyses for various entities here in the West. And he'll touch on how we might use intertie optimization as a way to make market transactions across seams more efficient. Last but not least, we have Richard Doing, Vice President of Grid Strategies, who brings a wealth of experience from his time at MISO. And I know that myself and a lot of the organizations I work with rely heavily on him for his expertise. He'll focus today on seams issues that arise from transmission constraints and what we might need to do, what we might need to change with regard to congestion management. Okay, I think with that, we'll get started. Bob.
Okay, morning, everybody. Welcome to Seattle. I actually grew up in Olympia and went to the UW, so this is coming home for me. Let's see, that is not mine. Yeah, there we go. It's my crappy pun that I could not come up with a good one, so skip that one. Go to the next slide. This is the warning many of you have heard many times. I don't speak for the commission or any of the commissioners or anybody else at the commission. I only speak for myself. I am legally mandated to tell you that. I like to add on that I am an economist. I'm not a lawyer and I'm not an engineer. So Paul hopes that the economists will learn about the engineering. I find that laughable because I will never understand physics. And no ex parte communication. So if we have any open contested proceedings, I cannot talk about that. So please avoid that. Or I guess do, and then I have to recuse myself from it and I don't have to work on it. So next slide, please. Okay, so Paul said, can you come and talk about the white paper? Why did FERC issue it? What did you cover in the white paper, et cetera? So this is, just an agenda here. Why did we issue the white paper? What seams are we talking about? Paul stole my thunder a little bit. A little bit of what happened in the East, although I have two great colleagues up here who know way more about the East seams agreements than I do. So I'm going to leave most of that to them. As I say, it's not rainbows and unicorns. East agreements haven't been perfect by any stretch. Not everything that was done there necessarily should be pulled over to the West. And then sort of our FERC's principles, the things we talked about, which we phrased usually as, these are things folks in the West should think about, which, it wasn't my paper, it was the commission's paper, and that's the way we phrase things. And then sort of, what's the path forward? Okay, we leave here, what do we do? What should we be thinking about? Okay, next one. Also, I'm going to talk really fast because every time I went through this, I took too much time. So we have a legal mandate to ensure just and reasonable and not unduly discriminatory or preferential rates, terms, and conditions and tariffs, as you all know. So we got a lot of comments in both the EDAM filing and the Market Plus filing saying, hey, there's going to be really bad seams issues in the West, and FERC, you should do something about that now. The commission chose to defer and say, well, we'll see how things play out a little more. We need some more information. I would have said we should issue a 206 right now and make you all have a JOA as soon as possible, but that wasn't my call. So as a result, what we eventually did is issue a white paper saying, hey, hint, hint, you should think about these things. Because the map, which Paul showed a nicer version than I have, but go to the next slide here. The map's not pretty. So on the right, obviously we have the West. You all know what this looks like. I'm not going to explain it a lot. You're crossing over each other's territories. You have firm rights held on the transmission system of a participant from a different market. It's somehow worse than the East, I think. Over in the East, though, of course, you know, we've got like ComEd, which is part of PJM in Chicago, sitting right smack dab in the middle of MISO. We have Entergy, which sits down kind of between SP, or the MISO sort of overlaps with SPP. So, you know, we have a lot of experience with that. And so, you know, speaking of, I guess, next slide, somebody said we have a long history of seams, I don't know, considerations at FERC. It goes all the way back to the ISO and the RTO principles from Orders 888 and 2000, where we said, hey, look, if you're going to have an ISO or if you're going to have an RTO, you have to coordinate with your neighbors. You just have to. That's one of the principles, we called it. And that was sort of the first step. If we go to the next slide, you know, that resulted in a bunch of different agreements. And by the way, I'm just calling them JOAs most of the time. Seams agreement, whatever you want to call them. I just use JOA as a generic term. Some of those were mandated, but most of them weren't. So for instance, MISO SPP, we issued an order saying you have to have a seams agreement. PJM MISO, we didn't actually issue an order saying you have to have a seams agreement, but when there, if you know the history, the alliance companies came in and said, hey, we want to have a new RTO that sits right smack dab in between MISO and MISO and PJM, and the commission said no. And one of the reasons we said no is it's going to cause a bunch of seams problems. Join PJM, join MISO, make your choices, but you can't have your own. And so as a result of that, we ended up with the JOA and a seams agreement. But then the rest of them, they were voluntary, I guess we'd say. And then on the right-hand side, you know, we just have various components of what those seams agreements have in them, those JOAs. It's not consistent. FERC has accepted as just and reasonable all of these, even with their inconsistency. And you can see various bits of them, you know, sharing emergency energy, everybody does that, right? Thank you. But not everything else. And I'll note that PJM and MISO have coordinated transaction scheduling, and as I marked as a yes up there, but they recently filed actually to get rid of it because it doesn't work very well. So there's one of your, you know, don't carry this over from the East, perhaps. Okay, so let's flip to the next slide real quick, which is sort of a sub-agenda. What could the West do? Or sorry, this is what is the West doing. I've skipped forward. We have this new NASB proposal. It hasn't come to the commission yet, so I'm not prejudging it here, but it's to enhance the enhanced curtailment calculator. Sounds like a really good idea from what I understanding of it. So that's something that's moving along. We're sitting here in this meeting. SPP had a symposium. There's ongoing meetings. CAISO and SPP have said, hey, we'll have a JOA by the time Markets Plus goes live, which is fantastic. Love to hear it. And then finally, the commission issued a report, which you will be giving to us by the end of September. So there's, right, I just want to acknowledge there's a lot going on. Everybody's trying really hard to make sure that the world doesn't burn down in the West here. Okay, now let's flip to the next slide, which is sort of a sub-agenda. So I picked out sort of three things here: how you model the transmission system, and what I'm talking about is transmission availability. What we called, I think we called a coordinated interchange in our paper, which is basically how do you maintain reliability, which is obvious that you need to do that. How do you manage congestion in some sort of coordinated way? And then the third one would be integrating your markets in some way to take advantage of economic trades. Let's talk about modeling the transmission availability on the next slide. And I'll be pretty brief about this one. It's not technically a seams issue, but it was in the paper and I thought it was important anyway. You know, there's more than one way you can model available transfer capability. ATC, the commission approved 3 different methodologies. And from my understanding, not an engineer, it's more accurate to do it via flow gate modeling because you're looking at real flows on the system. And so you know what ATC is actually going to be available. I think of that as sort of a long run consideration. If the West is a universe of transmission and Markets Plus and EDAM, and by the way, I always skip over RTO's West section, but they're there too. if those are sort of galaxies, you've got to split up the transmission and figure out who has what transmission. And if ATC can be more accurately modeled using flow gate modeling, then it sounds like maybe everybody should do that. We just recently approved Tucson Electric moving to flow gate modeling. So that was one of our sort of primary points is we're, thinking long run as you move from the long run into the day ahead market. How do we make everything work as efficiently as possible? Well, let's start maybe with that. If we all use flow gate modeling, that could be more efficient. I say could because, again, I'm not an expert in that sort of thing. Next slide. Moving into the day ahead and real-time markets, sort of think of it as the short run, I guess, versus that long run. Paul just covered this, right? You have market participants from one BA, one transmission owner participating in one market, but you have firm rights holders participating in a different market. You need to ensure that firm rights are acknowledged, are not violated. At the same time, you don't want two markets that are trying to optimize over the same transmission, thinking they both have rights to it, right? You don't want your two market operators doing that. You don't want to have any double counting. So there's a question then of what sort of agreement you can come to, and I'll note that who should be party to that agreement and where should the agreement sit or reside is kind of an important topic too. I don't know really the right answer to that, but maybe it goes in the transmission owner OAT. Maybe it goes in the market operator OAT. Maybe it's a quote unquote JOA and what form that takes, which I guess would end up in the market operator OAT also, but could be many things. So anyway, so I just laid out a couple of bullet points of you have sort of your best case scenario of firm rights holders schedule day ahead market and the other market. It gets so confusing without actually naming markets, because then you have a constraint in there and that transmission is taken up. But as you start to worry about, well, what happens if it doesn't get scheduled day ahead, but they want to schedule it intraday? What happens if you get closer and closer to the real-time market running? Are we running into inefficiencies in the market? How do you still ensure that those firm rights are observed? Okay, so let's go to the next slide here. Somebody yell at me if I'm going to run out of time too. Thank you. Coordinated interchange, that's just the name that we gave to sort of this idea that you can share information, etc. The market operators and the balancing authorities. And again, we're looking for enhanced or maintained reliability and perhaps even more efficiently maintaining that reliability. Let's skip to the next slide. I guess I could have skipped that slide altogether. So sharing data, this sounds like something everybody's already working on, which is fantastic, right? How do you model the network? Do you use some nomograms for constraints that trigger at certain points? How do you define an emergency? What happens if you have a market disruption and market doesn't produce results, which just occurred last week? Make sure everybody knows when those things happen and what actions get taken if they happen. And then for me, I think any JOA, you probably need to agree on those things, and it would be better if you had the same definitions and took the same actions, whether it's a market disruption, an emergency, whatever it is, all the way from normal operations to the emergency stuff. And then, one of the big points is loop flow, right? You will flow on each other's system. Even if you have a nice straight New York ISO to ISO New England border, which is almost exactly a straight line, they still flow on each other's systems. And it's like 1,000 times worse, it looks like, in the West. And I've used flip to the next slide. I use the Brady Bunch as my example. And I don't actually have time to go through the whole thing. But anyway, Peter and Bobby shared a room at one point and they put tape down the middle of it. And Bobby has to cross over Peter's territory to get to the hallway to even exit. Peter has to cross over Bobby's territory in order to get to the bathroom. They're not smart. They need an agreement that says you may cross over my territory this many times. And for those of you that aren't old enough, that thing sitting near the door is a TV. Bobby's not allowed to go over and mess with Peter's TV on the way out, right? You can flow on my system because loop flows will happen. Peter has to go to the bathroom. But there's a limit And at some point, you need to start paying me because I have to keep redispatching because you're causing congestion on my system, right? That's the reality. For those of you that don't know, I am talking about the whole thing. For those of you that don't know, the girls' bedroom is on the other side over there and is connected via that Jack and Jill bathroom. So you could cut through, but they could use a phase angle regulator in the way of a locked door to keep them from doing that, right? Which is what MISO did when there was Lake Erie loop flow, right? So it's real. It wasn't just for laughs. And one of my the one people ask me, okay, well, what advice would you give that we need to really do in the West is please do not agree to how much loop flow can happen based on a fixed point in the past that never changes, because you will end up in legal battles and fights as the East has done over and over. There should be a defined methodology for how and when you update these rights. And it should just happen automatically so that nobody can come back later and say, I don't like it. Well, too bad. You already agreed to it. Okay, next. Thank you. Oh, I have 5 minutes. I have so much time. I could talk about the Brady Bunch all day long. I'm actually going to end up taking less time, I think. This I've sort of talked about already. And I don't remember that we actually touched on it that much in our paper, but who should be at the table? People have asked me this too, and I'm like, I don't know. Like, I guess everybody who should be at the table. I mean, obviously that's the two market operators. I don't know that it's sort of fair to say only the big balancing authorities or transmission owners get to be there. You can't really, that seems unfair, right? So that's a lot of people. You could have a room full of 100 people trying to agree to a JOA, and that seems complex and convoluted. And what's the phrase? You want to get consensus on everything? Good luck. You know, so I do envision, however, a case where maybe it's just the market operators who have to come together like CAISO and SPP have been doing, and they negotiate what should go into the JOA. They go back to their respective stakeholder processes. They discuss it with their stakeholders. They come to an agreement with them, and then they go back, SPP and CAISO, and come together and say, well, this is what our stakeholders agree to. Excuse me. And then that JOA is not a big document that gets signed by 100 different entities. It's a JOA that simply resides in the EDAM tariff and resides in the Markets Plus tariff. And if you, as a balancing authority or transmission owner, want to join one of those markets, you agree to it. That's the way they work in the East. If you want to join PJM, you simply agree that you're going to abide by the tariff, which happens to include a JOA. And that might be sort of legally speaking the best way to house the JOA and I don't know, the way to get it done. It just seems to me that having 100 different entities trying to sign on to it is very difficult. I don't have to solve that problem. No, you do. So let's talk about the East a little bit. Can we go to the next slide? I am truly going to leave this stuff for my colleagues because they understand. I did used to work on Eastern matters when I was back in DC in the policy office in the old version of OAMR years ago, but that's been like 11, 15 plus years. The next step is, you know, can you save more money? Can we trade across the borders? And I sort of view this as being, there's sort of two different paradigms, I guess, as how you could set this up. One would be seller driven, buyer driven. That is, I'm going to submit a bid to import power from the neighboring RTO or ISO, and I'm willing to pay the following amount, or I'm willing to export at the following prices. The coordinated transaction scheduling works as a spread bid. You know, as long as the difference between the two is plus $50, I will sell, whatever it is. That's one way to do it. I think the argument for that is it lets market participants assess their own risk, et cetera. But the other way to do it would be to have it be driven by just the market operator. So if you're a seller, if I'm a seller sitting here and Holly and everybody at the table there are a different market, a different RTO, as long as I'm a seller and I submit my demand, my supply curve, and I say, well, for, you know, I'll give you 20 megawatts for at least $50. Why do I care who buys it, right? If I'm going to get $30 for it, fantastic, sell it. And if it's the market operators who are coming up with that trade, maybe that's a little more efficient and a little simpler. I don't know. I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on that, but it could be a little simpler. And that's my understanding of what SPP is doing with their intermarket optimization. Maybe somebody from SPP is here, can speak to that better than me. But the idea is that it's just the market operators talking to one another. They look at what available energy they have available, what prices, and they figure out, is there an efficient trade that could happen here? I know one of the issues in the East is lags, right? When the bids come in and what information market participants are looking at. And it does make me wonder, do the market operators have better, faster information? Can they take advantage of that quicker? So if we flip the slide, I think I actually literally just talked about all of this. So we'll skip that too. Let's go to the next slide. And at the end of the day, I really want to focus on the first and the last point. The first one, which did make it into our reporting requirement, which please prioritize the issues. Reliability is number one. We all say this over and over, but it is reality. Like managing congestion so we don't cause reliability problems on each other's system is the most important thing to do. I'm hoping that NASB proposal is really good and maybe helps a lot and gets us a long ways. But the market operators are still going to have to do something. And I think that includes probably efficiently allocating the costs of congestion caused to your neighbor. The last point is the other one that I wanted to talk about. And I harp on this to basically everybody from the ISOs and the RTOs who come and talk to me about market design, market participants too. I don't just get angry with short with the RTOs and the ISOs. And there are a lot of very complex market rules developed to reach some goal, whatever it happens to be. And there are times when I stop and I look at it and I think, oh my gosh, how many hours of people's time and effort are we spending? How much money is being spent on software development, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then what are you getting out of it? What benefits are you getting out of it? And I don't want to cite anything realistic, but I have seen market proposals come to us or be discussed, and I just think, why are you spending so much time on this when it appears you're getting almost nothing out of it? That's just me speaking. I only speak for myself. I don't speak for the commission. So keep that in mind. And with that, I'll wrap it up. Thank you. I have one more slide. That's my contact information. If you want to call me and tell me I'm wrong about everything, that's great. Email me first so I know it's you. Otherwise, I won't answer the team's call. So, all right. Thanks, everybody.
Great. Thanks. We're still on time, so I will ask my one discussion question, but we should have time for one or two questions after the discussion from either the room or virtually. So we're doing well. So we've had two exciting developments in just the last few weeks. We've heard quite a bit about them already. The first is the announcement that CAISO and SPP expect to have a joint operating agreement by the time Markets Plus goes live, and the FERC order directing CAISO and SPP to file a joint report documenting their SEAMS mitigation efforts thus far. These feel like big steps, at least from my perspective, because up until now, it's felt fairly murky as to who has the responsibility to solve seams in the West, putting solve seams in air quotes. It's felt, I have in my notes here, it's felt a little bit like the Spider-Man meme where the BAs are pointing at the MOs and the MOs are pointing at each other. And so these two things together feel like a concrete step in the right direction. The question is broadly for you, Bob, but also for anyone else that would like to jump in. From a FERC perspective, what is it that a JOA might allow us to do in the West, procedurally or otherwise, that we might not have been able to do without one? And going back to your variety is the spice of life slide as well, how will stakeholders, but FERC as well, know what a good JOA will look like?
I'm not sure that a JOA allows so much as it is a necessity, right? It's not like it frees up some new actions, but rather it's going to codify necessary actions. That's how I would view it.
If I can, the one thing I guess I'd add to that is it can also codify rules to make the economic trading more efficient and create a system to do that. So I think, like you said, it codifies necessary actions to avoid, you know, loop flow and congestion management issues, but it also can create a process that creates economic value too.
Yeah, that's a good point. That sort of points out my inconsistency. I say prioritize, and then I completely ignore the economic transactions because I think they're so far down on the list of getting done.
Totally agree
Yeah,
with that. I
but-
totally
but
agree with that.
but you're right.
It can be done.
What is a good JOA? I don't know. To be honest, I mean, I think I take that back. It has to have some basic stuff. I think it has to have congestion management in it. It has to have some definitions about, you know, let's phrase it this way. It has to have some definitions about how much damage can we do to each other before we get annoyed and demand that you start paying for it. I think that's one of the things that I would absolutely expect to see in it. You know, EDAM, you can flow this much power on Markets Plus system. And when you exceed that limit, you know, you're causing us trouble. And I don't know how you define the limit. Maybe you define it by required redispatch costs that Markets Plus has to do. Maybe you define it by megawatts. I don't know. But at some point, you got to stop flowing on my system, even if it's, let's call it accidental loop flow.
Great, thanks. I think any questions in the room, clarifying questions? And
Got a question in the room for your mic.
Todd Ryan with Pacific Gas and Electric. Thank you for your presentation. Really appreciate it. I was just going to ask how you, or if you've seen anyone define those loop flow limits well, and I think you started to touch on it in terms of dollars and megawatts, but are there other metrics or examples that might help people think about where and how we set those reasonable limits?
I'm afraid I don't have an example at hand. Eastern RTO JOAs probably have examples, at least we could look at.
Yeah, I will touch on that in my presentation. Unfortunately, there isn't a good solution. The mechanisms that have been used, no one likes. And the market monitor at PJM actually recently said we should just throw the whole thing away. We've been fighting about it for a decade and a half, and we can't find a better answer. So I can't point you to the silver bullet, but I will walk through in my presentation what they've done and what some of the issues have been surrounding that.
Well, and so, you know, maybe that means there isn't congestion management, but feels like there should be.
Yeah, I think I'll argue there should be.
are there any questions online?
Taking a look here, I don't see any hands raised at this moment.
Okay, one last call for any in the room. If not, we'll keep it moving. Okay, John, I think it's your time.
Well, thank you. First off, let me just say thanks for having me. Okay, hopefully that'll work better. So yeah, why don't we go ahead and, if you don't mind, go to the next slide. I'm going to talk about, I wanted to start by just talking about what do we actually mean when we say seams inefficiencies? Because that term gets thrown around a lot, seams, the inefficiencies they create, et cetera. What do we actually mean? And I have 5 examples listed here. There's probably more, but it's not just, you know, congestion management and inefficient economic trading. Seams create all kinds of issues when you have seams across markets or balancing authorities. I liked the way Paul this morning separated, you know, seams from market seams. Any of those, I think, create these kinds of challenges. So it's interregional planning, generation interconnection becomes more challenging. We have to think about affected systems. And then, of course, there's loop flow management and congestion management, inefficient trading, and then also, lastly, resource adequacy. Right? If you're planning on a siloed basis for your PRM and to maintain the same level of resource adequacy, that can be less efficient than if you do so as a group. So there's all kinds of inefficiencies that are created. And these aren't new. You go to the next slide. These have existed forever in the West, and actually there's a lot of efforts underway to address several of these. And I've just thrown some examples up here. This is not a comprehensive list, but obviously interregional transmission planning, we know that West Tech is aiming to address that. There's lots of partnerships with public-private entities, merchant entities to address that. And then with inefficient trading, like there's a long history of bilateral trading in the West through liquid trading hubs. There's the CAISO intertie trading. And then I would argue that the energy imbalance markets that have existed in the West are also examples of managing seams. Real-time trading seems to create efficiencies. And then, of course, RAP and the EDMR RA programs aim to address the resource adequacy challenges of seams. So all of these seams and all of these challenges have existed for a long time. We just address them in different ways. And I will say that I don't think necessarily that the two emerging day-ahead markets necessarily make all of these worse. Like some may actually make them better or mitigate some of them. I think, the markets will provide price transparency that could actually help increase bilateral trading or make bilateral trading less risky for those who engage in it, because you'll have price, a very clear price signal. So I don't think that markets necessarily make these seams worse. They just create a new one on top of it, which is now you have two market operators operating next to each other. If you go to the next slide. As Richard alluded to, he's going to, I think, talk a lot about number 3. So actually what I'm going to talk about is number 4. That's the economic efficiency and the trading between markets, and how do we do that better, hopefully. And I think like Bob said, and I totally agree with him, I think number 3 is the priority, because that can cause reliability issues if it's really bad. As well as, of course, economic benefits too. To manage it properly creates economic benefits. So while I think the number 4 is probably a lower priority, it shouldn't be forgotten, because there's real money on the table, and it can really help reduce costs for customers. So I'm going to focus, like I said, on number 4, and I'm going to do 2 things. I'm going to talk about some lessons from the East. So just like Bob, and I think Richard too, will draw on the experience in the East, mostly to show you what hasn't worked in the East, unfortunately. There's not really a great example of things that have worked from when it comes to seams trading anyway. Seams trading. I won't say everything, but seams trading. And then I'm going to, at the end, give you at least some sort of indicative value or idea of what kind of dollars are we talking about in the West? Like how much money are we really talking about that could be gained if this is done well? So if we go to the next slide. Okay, so let's start with some lessons from the East. We go one more. So this has a long history, and it continues today. RTO markets in the East formed in the late 90s, early 2000s, and basically right away, the market monitor started identifying that there was inefficient utilization of the interties between the markets. So Potomac Economics, who's the market monitor for several markets in the East, published this presentation in 2003, pointing that out. And then in 2010, pointed out that, or did a study to the 4 markets listed here between MISO, PJM, New York, and New England. If you had coordinated seams transactions and optimized seams transactions, you could save somewhere in the order of $150 to $300 million per year in production costs. And so because of that kind of study, the ISO studied it, and specifically ISO New England and New York studied it and put out a proposal. And they came up with 2 proposals. If you go to the next slide. They proposed intertie optimization and coordinated transaction scheduling. So those align very closely with what Bob just talked about, the 2 options he laid out, one of which is the kind of a bidder-based approach. That's coordinated transaction scheduling. So it is not an optimization, but it is a way, let's say, to facilitate bilateral trading on the seam. So you put in a bid to import or export power at the seam, and coordinated transaction scheduling is a way for the markets to kind of facilitate that from clearing. Intertie optimization is the other option Bob mentioned, which is the 2 market operators actually optimizing the use and scheduling the use of the intertie together. And the ISO New England, the 2 ISOs, I should say, put out a proposed approach to do that, actually worked through mechanically how that would be done. And it loosely resembles I won't get into all the details, but the link on the previous slide, you can click and read their white paper if you really are interested, from 2011. It lays out an approach that's kind of like a joint dispatch of the intertie, where it's an iterative bounces back and forth between the two control rooms to get to basically an iterated solution on the intertie based on market bids. So just like Bob laid out, generators put in a bid to sell. The markets share that information about their generators. They share the impact on shift factors of those generators on shared flow gates, and they come up with basically a co-optimized solution, if you want to think of it that way. That proposal was never adopted. They went with coordinated transaction scheduling for lots of different reasons. So it was first, coordinated transaction scheduling was first implemented between New York and New England, later extended to PJM and MISO. And the short answer here is that it has not worked. If you go to the next slide. So these are from the IMMs. There's a lot of information here, but so you can look at that later and digest it if you want, and look at the reports that were put out, the state of the market reports in both PJM and MISO. But the short answer here is that in PJM, the IMM has found that under coordinated transaction scheduling, literally more than half the transactions are flowing in an uneconomic direction on the scene. So basically, it's doing exactly the opposite of what we want it to do in most of the time. With same thing in MISO, 40%, that's what is circled in orange here at the bottom, 40% of the trades are going in the wrong direction. For MISO, Potomac Economics tested an approach that would reduce the time granularity of CTS to 5 minutes, and they found that that actually improves the situation and generates something like $70 million of savings by doing it on a lower time granularity. But if you look, even with the 5-minute CTS, you still have like 15 to 20% of the transactions going in the wrong direction. This is in their simulated approach, so this is not real. They tested that. And then at the bottom here, just a few weeks ago, MISO announced that they're dropping CTS, and so PJM and MISO will no longer have CTS going forward. And we'll see what the fate of it holds in other parts of the East. If you go to the next slide. So what are the basic differences here? I talked a little bit about that, but providing a bit more detail here. Intertie optimization, right? It optimizes in real time every 5 minutes. So it would be integrated and part of the real-time dispatch processes that the market operators do for both of their market. And then, it's hurdle-free, so it's de-pancaked. And again, because it's in real time, it's just would be based on available transmission or unused ATC on the shared flow gates between the markets. And then the value of the transactions are shared by the RTOs, and that's inherent, right? So like, depending on what the clearing price is, if a bidder put in a bid at 20 and the price was 30, as in Bob's example, the generator gets $10 of profit in whatever market they're in. Similarly, if you can deliver load at a lower price in the neighboring market, then load takes that benefit. So the benefits are, shared between the two markets, and would be inherently, captured by whatever the clearing prices are relative to costs in both markets. And we would think that would create high transaction volume, lots of benefits. And there is an example, I would say, further east, if you will, in Europe, where they do have this kind of market coupling, and we can talk about that more. So their markets are very different. They're not nodal, so it's not exactly the same thing. But they do have it's kind of a similar process to intertie optimization, where they trade between the different national markets in Europe. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So now I'm going to take just a couple of minutes to give you a sense of how much money are we talking about. And I think this is meant to be kind of illustrative and ballpark. We haven't studied this explicitly at Brattle, or at least not yet. But some of the results from the work we have done, I think, can be helpful in kind of maybe framing the magnitude of benefits we're talking about here. If you go to the next slide. These maps across the bottom here, I'm sure you guys have all seen before from all of our studies. This is from a study we did for NV Energy a few years ago. Most of our studies, we don't put out WEC-wide benefits, but for whatever reason, NV Energy wanted us to put out WEC-wide benefits as well as just for their own utility. And so what we have in that study that I think is interesting is we have a WEC-wide production cost value for all of these different market footprints. And what I hope to show here, or the point I hope to make, is that if you think, obviously we have one footprint where everyone is in the same market, so which could be, you could achieve benefits similar to that if you had really good intertie optimization. So I would use that as I hold that up as a proxy for what production costs could look like in the WEC if we had two markets, but with really good intertie optimization, as opposed to some of these other footprints up here where people go into different markets. And so if we compare the delta in production costs between, you know, the footprint where everyone's in the same market and the other ones, what's the delta? How much higher are the production costs? And in my mind, that's kind of an estimate of what you could achieve through intertie optimization. Okay, everyone follow that? So if we go to the next slide, the short answer there is it's about $150 million a year. So at least based on our simulation analysis, and I think in a lot of ways we're understating the benefit because the way we model seams between the two markets is just with a hurdle rate. So it's not exactly, doesn't in my mind fully capture all of the friction between the two markets from an economic trading perspective. And we still find there's about $150 million a year in benefits. That's what the orange call out here is off to the side. So in my mind, that's at least like ballpark gives you a sense of how much money we're talking about here. So, you know, it's not going to lower everyone's bills by a ton, but it's real money and it will help customers. So, so that's all I have. The next slide has my contact information. Well, actually, it doesn't actually have my contact information, but you guys know where to find me. But yeah, so anyway, any questions, we haven't answered them now, later. You can, same as Bob, it's better to email me, also, otherwise I don't answer unknown calls. So.
All right, that was a speed run. We're 5 minutes ahead of time, so thanks. Okay, so John and Bob have both touched on some of the reasons things feel much more complicated in the West. We have a complex and fragmented non-RTO landscape. We have different ways of modeling transmission, etc. Is it really as much of an uphill battle as it seems? And does the West have something going for us?
I can start. I don't think this is impossible or anything like that. Like getting a JOA together that will manage the seams well is definitely achievable in my opinion. I do think, as Paul mentioned in his introductory comments this morning, the fact that, you know, transmission service provider functions and balancing authority functions have not been consolidated in the West adds a wrinkle to it and a challenge. But I also think there's an opportunity there, at least from the economic efficiency side. One thing that happens in the East, another inefficiency that's created, I don't know if Richard's going to talk about this, is like, for instance, trades between MISO and SPP just have one scheduling point. So if there's a energy flowing from MISO into PJM, for example, if that generator that's selling it is in Minnesota, or if it's in Arkansas, or if it's in Michigan, it's all scheduled at the same price into PJM, which is kind of crazy. So one thing that's nice actually about the West inherently, because you haven't consolidated all the balancing authorities, is that you actually have kind of organically a lot of different scheduling points potentially for economic trades between the two markets from one BA to the other. And so, and there's going to be prices formed at kind of like the zonal level or the BA level by each market for generators and load to do settlements. Like those can also settle intertie transactions. So I think that's one thing the West has going for it, is it's already has more of a disaggregated seam, which can help schedule economic transactions across the seam more efficiently.
We'll see how this one does. Thanks. Yeah, let me focus on something slightly different. I don't think it needs, I agree with what John said, and I don't think it necessarily needs to be really complex or really difficult to solve some of the issues. I think, however, the simpler you make the solution, perhaps the more economic benefit or economic efficiency you lose. And let me give you an example. Recognizing firm transmission rights that cross over a different. That's not actually, I don't think, West specific. I think certainly the analog that I think of off the top of my head is MISO's grandfathered rights, which have been, I think they're still around, some of them. And they've been there for like 20 years. And they simply are a constraint in the system that says, you know, entity X has the right to flow these megawatts on this system and we can't use it. I mean, that's what those grandfathered rights essentially are. You could do that. So I'm picking out a different sort of seams issue here, but you know, you could do that in the West too, and just very strictly say, if I'm the market operator in market A, say, I know I have the rights to X number of megawatts on this particular line. There's 1,000 on the line and I have rights to 700 of it because of my participants, 300 of it technically are firm rights held by a participant in market B. And you could put that into your model and say, and it has a penalty parameter for violating that limit of $8 billion. And your optimization will never violate that. That is, but maybe that's not terribly efficient to go about it that way. There might be a better way to do it, but you could conceivably come up with, I don't want to say simple. Simple is just not the right word, but let's call it simple solutions that would work. But you're just they're knocks on your economic efficiency ultimately.
All of these issues get hard fast, so try and keep it at a high level. I think Bob was spot on when he talked about what needs to be in the JOA, and these things build on each other. And the first is reliability. If we don't keep the lights on, we're not going to talk about anything else. All of the other issues become very, very unimportant if we can't keep the lights on. So the first element of the JOA, and if you look at any of the Eastern JOAs, the JOA that's included in MISO's tariff, PJM's tariff, SPP's tariff, New York's tariff, New England's tariff, you're going to find a lot of words. Most of the words in those JOAs are about reliability. It's about information sharing. It's about operating procedures. It's about how you behave during an emergency. It's about how you reliably manage transmission constraints. That's going to be the bulk of the joint operating agreement. The next level, and that it evolves over time, is how do you fairly allocate use of the transmission system? And I'll talk about that more in my presentation when I talk about loop flow. So that would be the next element, and it's going to be very important here in the West, which I'll touch on as well, just because of the complexity of the transmission system, the complexity of the seams that we have here. And then you finally get to efficiency types of improvements that you'd like to see. That would be the last step. You have to take care of reliability first. Then you can think about how do we make sure it's fair for everybody, and then you can think about, after those two are already resolved, how do we make it as efficient as possible? When you get into issues like optimizing interchange, how do we encourage, incentivize, and reduce friction to trades across the market in order to lower costs for everyone? But that's kind of the last step, and you have to go through that progression of reliability, fairness, and then efficiency. And I think the West does have a lot going for it because you've already taken a really big step in that direction. You have real-time markets that have been operating for well over a decade. And you have a bunch of people in the region who are very used to those markets and how they operate. They've learned about how to participate in the market, how to bid and offer so that they can achieve benefits from those markets. And that's a great step in the right direction. There's also initiatives underway that were pointed to earlier, like the ECC initiative, which will help with congestion management, will help with some of the loop flow issues, and that's a great step going forward as well. So I think there are a lot of things already in place that are going to be very helpful, and there are lessons learned from other parts of the country and other parts of the world that both point you in directions you could go and in directions you might want to avoid.
Thanks. Yeah, one of the things that came up in our earlier discussions is this idea that there is no status quo yet. So we have an opportunity to start from scratch and sort of get it as close to good as we can the first time around. And one of the important things I think you've noted from other regions is that you can get to a point eventually where you lose either the momentum or the incentive to fix a bad solution. So trying as hard as we can to get it right the first time around feels like an opportunity for us here in the West. We have a couple minutes for any audience questions. Anyone in the room with follow-ups? Clarifying questions? Yes, we have one in the back.
Hello, Cameron Reed with Puget Sound Energy. Thank you for the discussion. You mentioned that, and I realize this might be a can of worms, but you mentioned that some of the Eastern ITOs went to CTS instead of coordinated interchange for a variety of reasons. Could you expand on some of those reasons? I feel like it would be helpful to know their thinking in that position.
That's a great question. So they actually do go into that in some of the reports. I think partly there was a hope that CTS was going to basically get you there anyway, and it's simpler, so why not just do it? Because if you read that initial proposal between the two, they do recommend the intertie optimization, the two ISOs, but they also are very high on the potential for CTS. So that's part of it. And then just that's where the stakeholders ended. So they went through a big stakeholder process. And I think there was a feeling, I mean, I didn't live that, maybe Richard knows or could add to this, but there was like a feeling that, look, this is going to get us maybe 80% of the way there. And it's really simple. So let's do that. And then in the end, it didn't get us anywhere. It got us 0% of the way there. But with hindsight's 2020, of course.
I think one of the big issues that they saw as well, particularly in the stakeholder process when they talked about it, is when you talk about turning something over to the market operators to optimize, in this case, interchange, you're taking that away from market participants. And there's a big sector of the industry whose only role is power trading. And one of the elements of that is trading between markets. So when you say we're going to take that off the table and we're going to give that all to the market operator to optimize, those people see opportunity lost. And so there was a big pushback on the notion of interchange optimization, in part driven by people who said, but I make money today by trading the seam. I think the lesson of history has been they actually lose a lot of money trading the seam as well, as was pointed out. But nonetheless, it is their business model is to trade, and if you take away that opportunity, not everyone likes that. So there wasn't universal acceptance of that. It also was not fully fleshed out. And when they proposed it, they said this is a hypothetical. There was an academic paper that was written that pointed out all the things they would have to figure out in order to implement it. So it was still just a notion and not a fully fleshed out idea. And that's part of why it didn't advance in the East. I think in the West, it may be worth pursuing at some point, but as Ben pointed out, it's probably 1,000 times more complicated. There's one line going between New York and New England that they were going to try and optimize. Here we're talking about a footprint that has a whole bunch of interfaces between markets and non-market areas. And from a technical perspective, it'll make it much more challenging.
Go ahead, Charlie.
Hi, thank you, Charlie. I'm in with the Washington UTC. Are there any reliability or operational risks that come from the sort of coupling that happens under intertie optimization?
That's interesting. I don't think that it creates any more reliability challenges than bilateral interchanges. You know, if you have intertie schedules that are put into a market but then don't show up in real time for various reasons, the market operators and the balancing authorities have to deal with that. So in some sense, like actually shifting it to the market operators takes away that uncertainty of what's gonna, you know, how much of this schedule is actually going to show up in real time. Because it becomes part of the real-time optimization. So I don't see that, but happy to hear what others have said.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can see immediately a reliability challenge associated with it. I will say, though, it will interact with other seams coordination mechanisms like congestion management. And it'll have other downstream implications like on transmission revenue that people receive for transmission for trading today. So there's lots of interactions you'll have to think through, but reliability isn't one that jumps to mind as one that would need to be managed.
Yeah, for those online, I'm just sitting over here nodding my head. Yeah, I would agree. I don't see a reliability issue.
And we might have a few minutes to go to anyone online.
Yeah, we do have one hand online from Tim Butts. If we could please unmute Tom. Sorry.
Thank you, Tom Butts, Minnesota Power. From a practical perspective, it feels to me like the stuff in the East is far more the exception in terms of interchanges between RTO to RTO. So it really strikes me that there's a huge challenge in the West, the way that the footprint is being, you know, the two different areas. And my main question is, how can an entity looking to make a long-term investment in an tie between the regions have any clarity or certainty as to the access, availability of resources, the certainty? There's just kind of a day one, I call it a MISO day one versus day two kind of approach, where you have all the footprints across all the BAs and you're trying to figure out how can I make an offer that's certain here, and just have a lot of concern about the long-term viability. And you know, you want to have that, all these major points are so important that you're making, but the whole thing of, like, you know, you're trying to find an engineering solution and an economic reality of trying to make it as seamless as you can, but just have a lot of concern about how this can be a workable approach in the long term that investment could look at and say that this is a good approach that will give us certainty as far as operating a tie between the regions?
Let me try to, I don't know if I'm going to answer the question. Maybe I'm just agreeing with you. Very briefly, I think in our white paper, I fought tooth and nail to have the phrase transaction costs mentioned as many times as possible as I could. Two markets, many TOs and BAs, all with their own tariffs. They all don't say the same thing. It just all introduces more and more transaction costs and makes it harder and harder for market participants to participate. I'm not a believer, let me rephrase that. I am a believer that the markets don't exist for their own sake or for people to be profit maximizers and have the advantage of taking money out of the markets. I don't think that's why we have the markets that we have. They are there to deliver reliable power at the lowest possible cost. However, given that we have them and I support them, I'm an economist, I think they work. We should be trying to reduce transaction costs. And I hate to say it, but the West has done everything it can to increase transaction costs in these markets. And so I'll just agree with you, Tom. How do you do it? Maybe the JOA is part of how you do it. I know, Paul, you said earlier, and I know Elliot has said this too, CEO of CAISO, we aren't here to discuss market rule changes, tariff changes, but maybe there are some changes that need to occur along the way to align the markets a little better. I don't know what those, I don't have examples off the top of my head, but maybe, you know, participation rules, everything down to bidding behavior, et cetera, you know, what your bid has to look like, whatever it is. Maybe if those all looked a little bit more like one another, then you reduce the transaction costs, you make it easier for market participants, and you can take advantage of the efficiencies that we expect the markets to bring us.
Yeah, and I guess one thing I would just say is I'd go back to a comment I made earlier. If you think about the West now, pre-market, there hasn't been a, you know, it's done a great job of attracting investment in infrastructure, right? The question's really about investors looking at this and making an investment. There's been a ton of money spent on transmission infrastructure, and it continues to be. There's been new resources added at a rapid pace across different parts of the West, and, you know, to accommodate load growth and all of that. So that's been finding a way to happen now without the markets. And I think the day-ahead markets only help that by creating transparency. There's going to be price transparency across the West for day-ahead power prices, for, you know, at a nodal level for the first time ever. The more that the markets can work on managing seams efficiently and reliably and fairly, as Richard said, it only helps reduce the opaqueness of that an investor looks at when they see the West. So I think markets are helpful. They're not, that's not their function. As you said, their function is not to like help investors make choices necessarily, but I think they certainly help.
I think focusing on one key element of the question, and you touched on it as well, John, was the question of investment. If we're talking about investment in new generation, and the question was, how do I decide where to invest? Given the seam, I think the markets certainly help send investment signals within the market. Where you have a problem is if you're in one market and you're thinking about investing in an asset that's in a different market. And the question was, so how do people make that decision? I'll tell you how they made it in the East. It stopped. There are no transactions. I shouldn't say no. There is a trivial amount of capacity that trades between MISO PJM, MISO SPP, PJM in New York, or New York and New England. And it's not just transaction cost. You can manage the transaction cost. What you can't manage is the uncertainty and the unhedgeable risk. If you are relying on a resource in an adjacent market and it has to be delivered to you, but you have no idea at what price, under the non-market situation we've had in the past, if you had transmission service, you were fine. What was the price? It was transmission service plus the fuel cost at the generator. That was your price. You knew what it was. When you're crossing a market boundary and you have no idea what the clearing price is, what the difference in price might be at the two markets as you're trying to transact across that seam, you have an unknowable and unhedgeable risk. And in the East, what we saw is just a termination of cross-border capacity transactions. There are a few trades that make sense in that environment using pseudo ties. We quickly delve into levels of abstraction that unless you're sufficiently nerdy in the industry, you may or may not be familiar with. But there are ways of overcoming that type of friction, but it's rarely used. It's not a broad opportunity, and so you really just see a lack of trading of physical capacity between markets.
Let me ask a follow-up, Richard, because you'll know this much better than I. How much of that trivial amount is also due to capacity markets with must-offer obligations that essentially don't let you trade across the border?
Well, once you've traded the capacity across the border, and take an example where someone actually does have a pseudo tie into PJM or MISO, in that case, you've accepted the obligation to must offer.
Okay.
And you're fine. And if you're thinking of investing and you can arrange that type of transmission service and contract, then you accept the must offer obligation and it all works fine.
Okay, so you're talking about like a power purchase agreement where
Right.
it gets pseudo tied across, and then you are in that other.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. Gotcha. Thanks.
What I'd add to that though is that the market rules in PJM make that explicitly difficult, right? Because you have to be pseudo tied in to even offer as an import. And so there are ways to, I think the market rules impact that they can mitigate that risk or lower the cost of mitigating that risk, right? Pseudo tie is expensive to set up. And so that's a lesson from the East too, is like eliminate those barriers to the extent you can. And some of those can be done through market rules, but some of them are just inherent in seams, like there's a risk there.
Richard, if you want to add any final thoughts to that, but otherwise I'd like to keep us moving to your presentation as well. Right, okay.
So maybe before I even go to the first slide, let me set up a couple of concepts to think about as we talk about the issue. And I'll try and keep this at a sufficiently high level because I know we're going to delve even deeper into it at subsequent meetings. The first thing to think about is, why do we even talk about loop flow? And that's one of the questions that I often get is, seems loop flow. We've always had loop flow. There's always been loop flow between systems in the West and other parts of the country, and there are mechanisms to deal with it. We redispatch, we curtail schedules when it's necessary. There are actions that we take. Why is this a new big deal? And so I'll talk about that, and it's because the nature of loop flow and the nature of flows on the system change when you introduce markets, and it's important. And so we need to talk about what is that change and what are the implications of it. The second thing that I want to just throw out for people to think about as we talk about loop flow is the fairness or equity issue that Bob alluded to. He said, don't flow too much on your neighbor system. There is an inherent fairness principle that underlies most of the coordination that we do on an interconnected grid. And the fairness principle says something along the lines of, operate responsibly and reliably your portion of the grid, bring enough generation to serve your own load, and don't unduly lean on your neighbors. Make sure you have enough transmission to get from your generation to your load. And everyone knows that on an interconnected system, you are going to be flowing somewhat on your neighbor's system. You're going to have a generator outage, and you're going to be hoping your neighbors are there to help you out. And that coordination has evolved and grown over the years. And we have now pooling agreements. We have agreements for joint sharing of operating reserves. Lots of different ways that the industry has evolved that level of coordination, but underpinning that is always the notion of there's fairness, and fairness requires, if we're going to share capacity reserves under a resource adequacy construct, everyone has to bring enough to the table in the first instance, and if you don't, you're going to get penalized. And that's that fairness issue at work. And that's very important for resource adequacy. It's also very important for congestion management. And I think Bob already walked through why that is. It's, if I built my transmission system, I built it to serve my own load with my own resources. If my neighbor starts flowing on my transmission line and I can no longer use it for my own purposes, well, I don't consider that fair. I paid for the transmission line, I paid for the generation, my responsibility to serve the load, and now I can't do it because my neighbor is flowing on my transmission system. That's that fairness or equity issue, and that's what underlies most of the issues around loop flow management at a market seam and within a market seam context. So if we go to the first slide, we'll talk about on this slide. So where are we today and what's changing? And what's changing is that we're going from a traditional system, and the system that we're in real time today where prior to the start of the day, we have some bilateral transactions that happen. There's some schedules that are submitted as between balancing areas or as between markets. They're based on transmission service, and there's a tag submitted that has a defined source and a defined sink, and we can tell where that energy is flowing. Then you have the market optimization, and this is really no different than when you had an individual utility optimizing its own resources, and it's just dispatching its resources to its load. In that case, you don't have tagged transactions. You don't know what the source and sink is. If some of that dispatch is flowing on your neighbor system, your neighbor has no idea where it's coming from. They just know there are electrons on the system. For the pre-scheduled transactions, everyone knows what the pre-scheduled transactions are. And if my system starts to get overloaded, I can look and see who's flowing on my system. Oh, it's my neighbor. They submitted a tag during sufficiently significant level of congestion. I can curtail that tag if I have to. I can call them up and tell them to stop it, get off my system. You can't do that with the dispatch transactions under network service or within a market. There's no transparency as to where those flows are coming from or going to, and so that makes it more difficult to manage. In the pre-market world, that all worked reasonably well. You had your own transmission, your own generation, you served your own load, you flowed a little bit on your neighbor system, that was fine. Think about a very simple, before we get to a full market, you have a merger between two utilities and they decide they're reasonably well configured. They're going to merge their operations and they're going to start dispatching these two utilities now as a single fleet of generators. Well, you're changing the flows on those two systems because whereas they used to only commit and run resources in one area for one set of load and another set of resources for another load, now they're putting it all together and you may dispatch generator way on the extreme side of one utility to serve load way on the other side of the utility. So you're fundamentally changing those flows. Now, if it doesn't have a big impact on your neighbor's system, maybe not a big deal. You used to be able to see those flows because it was scheduled under point-to-point transmission. There were tags, you could see it. Now you don't know anymore where that energy is coming from, but if you're not harming your neighbor, then nobody really knows. With a market, you get the same thing. Whereas you used to have a bunch of individual utilities, right now we're talking about in the day-ahead market, scheduling their own generation of their own load, maybe engaging with transactions with their neighbors, submitting a transmission schedule so everyone could see what transactions were being submitted as between neighbors. And then they turned it over to the market to optimize the flow in real time. When we now create these markets with the seams and the types of seams we have in the West, you're going to get a very different impact. So whereas previously we had good visibility into flows, minimal flows between neighboring systems, and tools that were in place to manage those flows, the system worked pretty well. But we're moving away from that when we go into markets, and most of the flows in the region will not be tagged flows. We won't have good visibility on sources and sinks. They will be untagged flows, loop flow. That's the definition of loop flow. It's an untagged flow that flows from one system on its neighboring system. And we have to have tools to manage that somehow. And we have to address the equity question that comes from, well, what if that untagged, unidentifiable flow impacts my neighbor? And my neighbor can no longer use the transmission the way they intended to, or it costs them more because they have to redispatch their own generation. So the fundamental change is that change going from a set of tagged flows, good visibility, to untagged flows, loop flow that's harder to track. So that's the big change that we see coming. If you go to the next slide, so what? So things change, flow patterns change. Why is this an issue now for markets? And it's really two areas that you have to look at. One is the reliability impacts, and how do we make sure that, given that we don't have good visibility into where flows are coming from, how do we work through the operational impacts of that? How do we protect existing usage if flows are coming from off of your system from a neighboring market and impeding your ability to use your own system? How do we try to put in place mechanisms to prevent that from happening? And then lastly, how do we make sure that any cost of redispatch is fairly allocated? So if I have to redispatch my own market because my neighbor's market is using transmission at a greater level than historically has been the case, my market's paying for that. should it, or should there be some mechanism to make sure that whoever's causing the congestion is paying for that congestion? So that's the question that loop flow raises, and the reason why loop flow is an issue, and what's changing the market. If we go to the next slide, so how have other markets tried to deal with this? First, we have to realize that it's impossible to deal with on a consolidated region-wide basis. The problem is just too complex, and if you really want to do that, you just eliminate the problem by a better configured market. You'd have one market, and you'd forget about all of it. But that's not the reality. It's not the reality in the East. It's not the reality in the West. We already have multiple markets operating, so we have to figure out how we're going to deal with that. And the way that they've dealt with that in the East is to say, well, let's just identify the most highly impacted transmission lines. We know we can't deal with it on every single line. Let's look at the lines that are most highly impacted. We'll agree on some coordination procedures. We'll agree on some fair way of allocating the use. And then we'll come up with some management mechanisms to manage, jointly unload those constraints when they occur, and to allocate the cost associated with that. So that's how they've tended to do it in the East. And the way they protect the equity portion of that, and Ben alluded to this as well as to some of the complications with it, is they try to define a set of rights that both markets have on each other's system. There's no obvious way to do that. And so what they did in the East is they said, well, we're going to take the last year before market started, 2004. That was just before the PJM market started. We're going to look at all of the firm point-to-point transmission rights that were in existence at that time. We'll look at all of the traditional dispatch patterns of the individual utilities or power pools at that time, and we'll see what the flows look like. And we'll just take a point in time. You can't do it for 8,760 hours. You won't be able to operate around that. So let's just look at 1 hour, and we'll look at what those flows look like, and we're going to divvy up the system on that basis. And they called those firm flow entitlements. So they were looking at network service and firm point-to-point transmission. And they said, and now going forward, if any market goes over its firm flow entitlement on the neighboring market, we'll have a mechanism whereby in a non-market to market context, you'll just ratchet back your dispatch to stay within your limit on your neighbor system, or under a more advanced market to market and economic efficiency kind of approach, we'll redispatch the system and decide who's going to pay the cost of that redispatch based on whether or not you are using more transmission than you were entitled to. So that's the mechanism that has been put in place in the Eastern markets. And I'll say from a reliability perspective, it addresses the reliability concerns. You're looking at the most highly impacted flow gates. You're making sure that you have good visibility on the flow. You've got a fixed set of rules for how you're going to redispatch the system to keep those flows within the transmission limits. And you've got a way of allocating the cost associated with that. So from a reliability perspective, it works really well. The issue is from a market perspective, doesn't work as well. And if we go to the next slide, I go through some of the issues that we've seen there. I've already talked about the left-hand side. What works, it's reliable. You can reduce the cost of managing congestion if you have market-to-market types of agreements in place. And under those agreements, when it's constrained, you look at which market can most cost-effectively alleviate this constraint. Setting aside what your rights are in the constraint, if you can reduce the cost more cheaply than your neighbor, you reduce the cost, and then we'll settle up afterwards based on where we were relative to our rights. So it's efficient, it's reliable, it's improved situational awareness. There's data flowing back and forth between the RTOs all the time about what flows are, and it's worked reasonably well, establishing a mechanism to trade funds based on that redispatch. What remains difficult about it? One is that you base that set of entitlements on that fixed snapshot from 2004. By 2007, people realized that with generators retiring, new generators coming online, load growth, that fixed snapshot in time based on 1 hour in 2004 didn't look as fair anymore. And so they started talking about, well, how are we going to change that? And they talked, and they talked. And in 2026, they're still talking, but they mostly stopped talking because no one can figure it out. So it's gone through several iterations, and everyone can agree that it's not fair. because the topology has changed, the generation mix has changed, the load has changed, but nobody can agree on what a fair alternative might look like. And so as a consequence, they have to file, the RTOs in the East that have these JOAs in place have to file with FERC on a periodic basis and say, how are things going under our joint operating agreement? What are the issues outstanding? What are we working on? This one has shown up every year. And they always say we're working on it and we're talking about it. We think we might even have some good ideas. And in the last go round, I think it was more along the lines of, we're still thinking about it. We still think it's a problem. We're going to get to it someday. So they've more or less given up. And as I mentioned earlier, the IMM in PJM has thrown up their hands and said, this looks intractable. Can we just throw away the concept and we'll figure out something completely different for how we're going to allocate cost for flows on each other's system when we have to manage them jointly? I think that's likely not to go very far. The market participants will not view that as meeting that basic fairness principle. So it has some flaws associated with it. It has the benefit of it throws out something that nobody thinks works. It has the disadvantage of not replacing it with something that everyone agrees is a fair substitute. So that probably will not go very far at the end of the day. Other issues associated with it, it is administratively difficult. You have to, in real time, every hour of every day, be monitoring the system. If you have a new transmission line, a new flow gate that you've identified as being impacted heavily by both markets, you have to designate that as one of those limited number of flow gates you're going to manage. Engineering process to do the study, you have to get into the market dispatch algorithm, and then you have to go through the settlement process. And even though the rules are very clear in the joint operating agreement as to the types of studies that you'll go through, there's still disagreement on individual flow gates on whether or not it should be coordinated. And the disagreement usually comes down to how much money is going to be involved in redispatching to manage that constraint. In the worst example of that, and this has now been at FERC and the federal courts, there was a transmission line between SPP and MISO, became a new binding coordinated constraint due to the addition of a new data center, which dramatically changed the load in the area, resulted in, I think the last number I saw was $42 million of congestion costs that was borne by a small Midwest utility, Montana Dakota Utilities. It went to FERC. FERC said, no, that's what the rules say. So that is the right outcome. It went to the federal court and they said, well, FERC said it's the rules and FERC gets to rule on this kind of issue. And so it's a ongoing problem. So it works as long as you have a set of rules. The rules can result in unintended consequences. They're intended to be fair, but not everyone agrees they're fair as they play out over the years. And that's an issue that will just have to be dealt with. So the long and short of loop flow is it's an important issue. It's a real issue because flows change when the markets start, when they're up and running relative to the past. You need some way of dealing with the reliability, efficiency, and fairness element of those changes. And it's not easy. There hasn't been a solution that's been found that addresses all three of those pillars. We can address reliability, we can address efficiency, fairness, not as well. I think Ben mentioned, please don't lock in a set of entitlements. I think that's probably wise. Ben also said you need to have some way of divvying up the transmission capacity. So you have these conflicting objectives. There has to be a way of putting in place something that everyone deems as fair. The way we've tried it so far had some consequences that 20 years after the fact, actually 26 years after the fact, not everyone agrees is fair anymore. So it's a difficult problem, but one that is going to have to be addressed as we get into having multiple markets operating in the West. And that will be the subject for, Paul is still in here someplace, I'm sure, one of the later sessions when you look at potential mechanisms for addressing some of these seams issues. Thank you. My last slide, I think, does have some particular issues that I just walked through. So what's the opportunity? implement something, make sure the coordination works and have some governance around it so it can be updated. The markets are going to evolve much faster than these agreements can evolve, as we've seen in the East. And so make sure you do something, but you do something that's sufficiently flexible. And then the last slide just has my contact information. I think it does have an email, so feel free to email me if you have follow-up questions. I have John's email and phone number. I'll be happy to give you his email or phone number. Thank you, Coffee.
Thanks, Richard. Okay, so Richard's given us, I think, the last major piece of the puzzle, which is how the economics interacts with the physical infrastructure. And amongst all of our panelists here, we have a few different promising concepts, solutions that might help us address seams. I think the question now is, assuming we as stakeholders and the market operators can't address all of these things at once, where do we start and how do we think about prioritization? Are there some logical combinations or a necessary sequencing of how we might address some of these? And maybe to tack on a sub-question, how do we think about market design, seams impacting market design that might be locked in versus design that can be iterated upon? How do we differentiate between those two?
I would say we talked about some of this already in terms of the sequencing, and that is reliability, equity, and then efficiency. And it'll be important to work through the issues in that order. In terms of, are there kind of logical groupings, or are we just selecting off of the menu for a tasting menu or something? I think that there are some logical groupings, and there are some things that you'd have to think about together. If you were going to pursue something like interchange optimization, you would have to look at how you were doing congestion management. You would have to look at things like how you're allocating and managing transmission costs. Both Markets Plus and EDAM develop mechanisms where transmission providers would be compensated for lost point-to-point transmission revenue. If you go to interchange optimization, you're eliminating more point-to-point transmission service, and you will likely need to address additional lost revenue. Not saying that should stop you from doing it, not saying that it's impossible to do, only that it is an interaction. You have to think through all of those interactions carefully. And that will be true with many of the different opportunities that you have for introducing market mechanisms and operational mechanisms to deal with seams issues, is you're going to have to think through carefully, what are the downstream consequences? How do these various mechanisms interact with each other? And how do we make sure, Bob used the point of, you could try and implement something that's so expensive, the cost benefit isn't there. How do you make sure that as you add these things onto each other, that you're always adding something that is cost beneficial and you're not actually moving the wrong direction on some other item that you've implemented? That would be my answer based on my experience in the Eastern RTOs.
No, I think Richard said pretty much what I was going to say. Yeah, there's some things that just do logically go together. Reliability is your first concern. It's whatever, data sharing, et cetera, goes along with reliability. In terms of the question of iteration or updating of agreements, started to cross my mind. Do you have to worry about strategic behavior or something that could impact future updates? I was thinking of this in terms of firm flow entitlements. If you just said, well, if I said to my bosses, we should just force the Eastern RTOs to pick a new date, and I'm going to pick July 30th of this year. Just tough luck. That's what it is. And you're going to update it again on what date did I say? July 30th, 2030. That's when you're just going to update it. Do I need to actually worry about strategic behavior? And I'm kind of thinking I don't, because it's a system optimization, and you don't have market participants having a way to really play that. And I don't think the market operators themselves have an incentive to play it, and how they would. But I'm sure there are other things that might have, you might worry about strategic behavior and how an individual could play the market a little bit, knowing that some sort of update was coming. Off the top of my head, I don't know what it is, but that's one thing I would keep an eye on.
Yeah, one thing I'd say there, so going back to the question about how market design, does it need to lead or follow this seams thing? And I don't think there's any, I think given the designs as there are today, you can put together congestion management that maintains reliability and is fair and all of that. But I think one of the big takeaways from all of our talks is kind of the danger of good enough. And then 25 years later, you're still living with it and it's good enough. It keeps the lights on and no one's suing anybody over it. So we'll just leave it in place. But so I think part of where you could see market designs evolve is over time, like revisit what is in place, make sure that it works well. Obviously, that includes like observing past behavior, and has there been strategic behavior we've seen that distorts market outcomes? And if the answer is yes, how do we mitigate that going forward? So I think part of it is, I don't think there's something that necessarily has to change today, but over time, sure, why not? If there's a way to like evolve the two market designs to make them more compatible and increase economic efficiency or improve reliability at a lower cost, like why not?
All right, we have 6 minutes for audience Q&A. Anyone in the room with a question? I see one in the back. Thanks. Give us a moment to get the mic to the speaker. Thanks.
I'm online for 1 second. Hello, thank you again, Vijay Satyal, WRA. So we have a few regulators in the room. What would be a suggestion you would give them in terms of, don't worry, John, won't affect your testimony wherever you've done. What would you suggest to them in terms of proactive thinking that can help reduce the unintended or unexpected costs that could come from either transmission commitments that the utilities have with transmission customers, or if any of them do have pseudo-tie contracts and they have to be paid for. And so if they're going to ratepayers to ask for money to join these markets, what would the regulators think about, or what's in public interest to ensure that those unexpected outcomes could be managed better? Part one of the question. Part two is, I've heard from market operators that they say, we can report on anything if the utilities ask us who will be market participants. So what would be good from a market monitoring perspective to better understand these SEAMS impacts? Thank you.
I guess I'll take a first crack. For the first part, I think Richard already talked about the fairness principle. I think that's what advice to, I guess, regulators would be, is we have to go into this with the understanding that with two markets, there's going to be some use of each other's system. Like it can't be perfectly avoided, but can we come up with a way to compensate each other or limit it so that it is fair, and understanding that it's an even, let's say, use. So that's the first thing, is an understanding that it's never going to be perfect, but having something that is fair is achievable and should be achieved. And that's the standard, I guess I would say. So that would be my answer, but happy to hear others.
I would say one thing the regulators certainly could ask is for the utilities to come in and explain how they're preparing for the introduction of the market. And what I'm thinking specifically there is making sure that the utilities have thought through all of the implications. What I've seen so far, a lot of studies that are based on production cost models that say, well, here's what the dispatch impact is. What I don't see, and while that's a valid item to look at, when you're doing a planning study in IRP, you wouldn't find it acceptable in most cases for the utility to show up and say, well, I did a production cost model, here's what I'm building. You'd say, well, there are a lot of other factors. Talk to me about all of the other factors. And within a market context, you might want to talk about, explain to me imports and exports, and are you relatively long or relatively short? What's your participation in the market going to look like, and what's the effect going to be on ratepayers? For your resource planning, based on where you're located, how is that going to impact your resource planning going forward? Looking at transmission revenues, all of those other issues. If you have a lot of renewable supply, tell me about how that is going to work within a market for balancing your portfolio. If you rely on interregional transmission to address seasonal variation in weather, tell me what that's going to look like under this new market structure. None of that gets picked up in a traditional production cost model. All of those real world operating types of issues. And I think it would be very beneficial to have a broader discussion around that, because I see those as being actually probably much more much more important than some of the economic issues that we've been talking about today. The more limited ability to manage variable resources, reliability impacts, the long distance interchange that the region has always relied on, those are all going to be negatively impacted. And I think there hasn't been a conversation about that. And it would be beneficial for regulators to be asking the utilities to explain that to them.
Oh, I was just going to say that I thought Richard's comments were particularly good when you talk about these resource planning studies that are looking out into the future, the sensitivity analyses, you do around these about what imports do I think I can rely on, et cetera. It's like just hugely important. They can just sway the results so much. And I'm still very, very hopeful that RAP, and if there's a new ROE EDAM related RA program, that those produce public information showing what sort of capacity is available in the West, what sort of transmission is available in the West. I would personally love to have more information on who owns transmission and what they do with it day to day. I kind of can't wrap my head around the analysis I would do with it, but I would really love to see the data more to know, because I think that's a big issue in terms of like what information could be produced, whether it's by DMM, I think you said, or whoever it is that has that information and has the right to release it publicly. So
We are at time. I know we have one more question in the audience. Do we have time to grab it?
Yeah, we have Fred.
Okay.
Morning, everybody. Fred Hewitt, Northwest Energy Coalition. Thanks to the City of Seattle and Seattle City Light for this wonderful space, beautiful day. The coalition, our headquarters is actually a few blocks from here, so welcome everybody. A question I've been looking at the Eastern Seam situation for a while. When you look at the SPP MISO JOA, which I've actually read, what we're seeing in the last several years is consistent net transfers from MISO to SPP up around $100 million a year, plus or minus, that started showing up around 2020. And I'm not exactly sure what the reason for that is. Is that kind of net financial transfer between market regions something that we have to consider in the West? Is that a sign of a Seams agreement that is actually working properly? It's kind of been a persistent question for me.
Yeah, Fred, two things. One, I have not been with MISO and had to dig through that level of detail for about 3 years myself. So I can't tell you exactly what might be driving that. Once upon a time, I could have found a report on my computer. I'm sure it answered the question. You will expect to see dollars flowing between markets under a joint operating agreement that includes joint dispatch of constraints. Money doesn't flow between the RTOs associated with trade. That flows in the market settlement system as between participants in the market. But to the extent that one region is dispatching to manage loop flow on its neighboring regions under the terms of the agreement, they may have to send money over to pay for that redispatch cost. And if that's the data that you're looking at is the flow of money between the regions, it's likely associated with that redispatch cost. But you asked an important question, and does that reflect a fair distribution of the cost? And without having more information, I can't answer that other than to say, at least in some instance, in the one case I pointed to with Montana Dakota Utilities, there were a few tens of millions of dollars there that were deemed, at least by some parties, to be unfair. So it will be in the eye of the beholder, but you do expect to see those transfers of money. It's an expected and good outcome when you're efficiently managing the transmission system. Whether or not it's fair in all cases, it's a separate issue.
Yeah, let me add on some speculation. When Entergy joined MISO, it led to immediate problems for SPP that MISO was flowing so much on their system. They filed an unexecuted transmission service agreement with the commission that had millions of dollars of fines going to MISO for their use of SPP's system. And it finally got the both of them to the table to work out how much power was flowing between the northern traditional or longstanding portion of MISO and the new Entergy territory. So I do wonder, is pure speculation, but I do wonder if a lot of that money flowing from MISO to SPP might still be related to just a lot of loop flow because MISO is trying to send power between those two regions that don't really have much connection. Whether or not you want to draw similar conclusions for what could happen in the West, I don't know, because I suspect a similar case would be ComEd in PJM. So that might be another case to look at that would be sort of the same.
Yeah, I guess I was going to talk about the energy example as well. I also would not venture to guess what the outcome will be in the West, but I will say that that situation between MISO and SPP that resulted in those huge transfers is probably the largest example out there. So will the West be that big in magnitude? That's hard to say. I would hope not, and I hope there's a way to manage it that doesn't. But again, if it's all about like what it ends up being fair. So if one market does use the system, like this example Bob just talked about, when Entergy joined MISO, then that was fair in that sense until it was resolved in some way. And MISO they did impose kind of a limit between north-south transfers to basically mitigate that and limit those costs. And again, whether that's fair or not is a question for market participants.
I will say you've noted that it's a good example. The other thing it's a good example of is how litigious these conversations can get around the agreements that need to be put into place to manage seams. That also went through several rounds and tens of millions of dollars of lawyers in order to get that agreement put into place. And FERC had to rule on it a couple of times, and it's an ongoing area that they have to discuss and file at FERC to explain what they're doing. And that agreement has been updated from time to time. It'll be similar to the West in that agreement between MISO and SPP involves Southern Company, TVA, Associated Electric, SPP, and MISO. So it's a whole bunch of people who had to get together, or you have a multi-BA context as we do in the West. You will likely see similarly complex agreements that will be developed and put in place.
Okay. I thank you. We are over time, but this was a great conversation. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. A big thank you to our moderator as well, along with our panelists. We'll be taking a short 10-minute break and resume at around 11:15. So please grab some beverages, some snacks. Just a reminder that the restroom, if you head out this door and head to the opposite wing across the lobby, you'll find the restrooms over there. But let us know if you need anything. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Welcome back from break. We're going to be getting started here again shortly. If you could all make your way to your seats, please. Wonderful. So now we are going to be hearing a regulator panel discussion. Our moderator will be Anna McKenna, Vice President, Market Design and Analysis at CAISO. Our panelists will include Gabriel Aguilera, Commissioner for New Mexico Public Regulation Commission, John Hammond, Commissioner for Idaho Public Utilities Commission, and Ann Rendell, Commissioner for Washington Utilities and Transportation Commission. So I will go ahead and turn it over to Anna to get us started.
Thank you, Christina, and good morning, everybody. It's so wonderful to be here in Seattle. I just wanted to say thank you again to Seattle City Light for hosting us today in this wonderful location. I can't think of a better view and a better way to enjoy a morning together and talking about such an important topic. So welcome, and thank you all for being here. I am joined by three esteemed state regulators to get their perspective, insight, and input on market seams. I'll introduce each of you and then have a few questions for your consideration. I'll go through the questions and then ask I'll choose a commissioner to go first on each of the questions, and then we'll continue on that way. But we'll have the commissioners each have an opportunity to answer all the questions. We may have some time for questions. I will say I think we're running a little bit late. We may not have too much time for questions, but really excited to hear from the commissioners today and their thoughts. This panel was sequenced, I think, appropriately after the last panel in terms of laying the stage on thinking about all the things we need to think about when we think of as seamless a world as we can be in. But yes, a very good panel, our earlier panels. So no stress, guys. We're going to be okay. We're going to be answering all the great questions. I will start with introducing each of our esteemed commissioners. I'll start with Commissioner Aguilera. Commissioner Aguilera is a member of the New Mexico Public Regulation Commission, where he focuses on regulated utilities' obligation to provide affordable utility services and essential grid infrastructure investments. Prior to joining the New Mexico Commission, he spent 15 years, that's not a jail sentence, but he was 15 years at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, where he held multiple key positions, including Senior Policy Advisor for the Office of Energy Market Regulations, Western Region. He currently serves as Chair of the Western Energy Markets Body of State Regulators, also known as the BOSSER, and has served as a key member of the Southwest Power Pools Markets Plus States Committee, also known as the MSC. Welcome, Commissioner Aguilera. Anything you would like to add to your intro?
Not to my introduction of my bio, thank you. I always wonder like where that came from. Sometimes it's my staff that provides it, but it seems true. Thank you for having me here. I'm excited to, have this panel and also appreciate the last panel that we just had. So look forward to the conversation.
Also joining Commissioner Aguilera and I is Commissioner John Hammond. Commissioner Hammond serves on the Idaho Public Utilities Commission. Prior to joining the Idaho PUC in 2022, he worked for the Idaho Office of the Attorney General as Deputy Attorney General and later as the Commission's lead Deputy Attorney General. He currently also serves as the Vice Chair to both the Western Energy Markets Body of State Regulators and SPP's Markets Plus States Committee. Busy. Welcome, Commissioner Hammond. Anything you would like to add to your intro?
Just thank you for having me here today. Good initial panel, really enjoyed that. As far as my background, I was in private practice for a bit, and prior to that, I wasn't in this area of work. And so, where I started from and how I got here is sometimes sort of a mystery, but I found my home. So thank you.
Well, last but not least, also joining us today is the esteemed Commissioner Ann Randell. Commissioner Randell was first appointed to the Washington Utilities and Transportation Commission in 2014. Commissioner Randell currently serves as President of the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, also known as NARUC. She also serves as Washington's representative to the SPP's Markets Plus States Committee, and previously served as chair of the Western Energy Markets Body of State Regulators. Welcome, Commissioner Randell, and perhaps you have some initial.
So thank you all. This is thanks to CAISO and Seattle City Light for putting this together, allowing us to use this amazing space and showcasing what it really looks like in July and August in Seattle in the Northwest. So that's I think the other thing I would add is similar to John, I started in this space without really focusing on energy and markets. And so it's been a learning. This is my 33rd year working with the Washington Utilities and Transportation Commission. If you haven't heard it before, I am not seeking reappointment. So this is my last year and time to do something a little different. Don't know what that is.
Well, I had not heard that before, and I'm a little disappointed, but okay. Looking forward to what the next exciting assignment will be. As I noted earlier, we'll have a series of questions, but before I get started, I thought it would be nice to have an opportunity to hear from the commissioners on some initial thoughts on how they would like to see the SEAMS discourse unfold among us going forward. Again, I'll start with Commissioner Aguilera and then ask Commissioner Hammond and Commissioner Randell to comment.
Thank you. And, when I did get that question in advance, and part of the question also was where we are. And so that's the part of the question that I had planned to answer and focus on. And so I'll start with that, was where we are. We're starting with a complex and intricately woven web of transmission paths. And then layered on top of that, we have firm rights on one system that are intended for the entities in the other market. And so we're starting with a transmission system that was not designed for a regional market, much less 2 or even 3 regional markets. The transmission planners, when they were designing that, didn't know what an EDAM was or what a Markets Plus was. And so that's kind of where we are right now. And then the web of transmission with multiple markets is very tangled. And right now we don't have the luxury of untangling that, but we do have the need to untangle it enough to understand it, how it looks and how it works, so that we can set rules and parameters around that transmission system that make the most sense. So part of the question was where we are. So we are here in this room figuring this out. That's the point we're in right now, is the point where we need to find solutions before both markets, or, well, we already have 2 markets operational, but before Markets Plus is operational as well. And we need to do that in a way that ensures that the value, the savings that we have been searching for throughout this whole process is not eroded for ratepayers. And we need to do that in a way that that value is fairly distributed to ratepayers. So on the discourse, I think my fellow commissioners here will have some good points on that. So that part I'll leave to them, but just wanted to provide, from my perspective, where we are right now.
Thank you. Well, Commissioner Hammond, do you have any thoughts as to where we are and what you'd like to see the SEAMS discourse to look like going forward, perhaps?
Well, I start from, at least for EDAM and SPP Markets Plus, with the idea that, remember why we're here and talking what Gabe just said, the value, where the value is for ratepayers, the value is for reliability, the value is for things that benefit the West, the businesses, the customers, the individuals that will benefit from an efficient market operation. So I start from there, and then I go to what my duties are as a state commissioner, and that is, we have to make sure that as best as possible, the utility is providing safe and adequate service to their customers, and that we're attempting to ensure that their customers are paying just, fair, and reasonable rates. And so what I'm looking at is, and what I'm, I guess, encouraged about is the efforts of both markets to get together to address these issues, to ensure that, as Gabe said, that the value is not eroded by some of the challenges of SEAMS, and that there's a continued commitment to improve upon that, to make those SEAMS issues less impactful on that value. So I'm very encouraged with that. And as a state commissioner, I wish for my staff, not my staff, excuse me, the staff of the commission, to be able to see into these things, to have the ability to have visibility into these transactions, because at our level, of course, we're looking at what the utility is spending, or costs that are being incurred and the benefits accrued through somebody like Idaho Power or Avista or PacifiCorp, Rocky Mountain Power. And that transaction, we will see that side of it. We may have some challenges seeing the SEAM transaction and all the operations there. So that's going to be an important part for us to be able to see beyond what the utility is engaging in. And I know the utilities will help us do that. But anything, if I can encourage anything, is that both markets help us do that, to ensure that that value is not eroded. And as I said, I'm pleased to hear the discussions that have been going on and the leadership of FERC in issuing some proclamations about how we get there and what they would like to see. So I think we're starting out well. My concern, though, at the end is we're not going to know, and I don't think it's going to be intentional, but everything's going to work fine with Seams. We're going to work through these things and make it the best we can. It's when things break, how are you going to react? Because there's going to be some challenges and bumps along the way. And how do we react to address those challenges too? So the transparency into how it operates, I think the intention of everybody is to make this work efficiently. But when things go wrong, can we avoid litigation and other expensive, inefficient means of solving our problems and get to a solution that works? So thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Hammond. I think both of you have touched on some important themes in terms of the transparency and where we're at in terms of the entanglement of the system and how important it is to have good information and a little bit of a message there, I think, for the market operators in terms of providing that additional visibility. So thank you for that. Well, Commissioner Randall, perhaps you have some thoughts, initial thoughts as well on how you'd like this discourse to unfold.
Well, banning cleanup, I really echo Commissioner Aguilera's comments about sort of the existing place that we are and how different it is from, it's hard to compare to Eastern utilities given, where we are and the fact that it's not RTO to RTO. It's very much BA and transmission operator interconnection, and it's going to take a lot of work. I think it also goes to the question of what's the value and then what the prior panel talked about of why do we do this in the first place? It's not so people can make money. It's so we can be more efficient in our operations. It's so we can provide that affordable, appropriate service to customers that's reliable and more so than what we can do now. And so I think really what I want the discourse to look like, and I think this meeting is a really good start to that, which is we need to stop being tribal. We need to stop thinking about why ours is better than somebody else's. And if we want to make it work, how are we going to talk to each other? And like I said, this is a really good start. And I know that CAISO and SPP have actually been sitting down and talking to one another and not being tribal. And so I think we all together need to do that, make sure the information is flowing to everyone in the West. And just remember that we've already seen what happens when things don't go well in the past, not just here in the West, but we're seeing it now in the East. And so I think we need to really hold true to it's about reliability and it's about efficiency and getting benefit to customers. And if we focus on those three things, I think we'll have a chance of getting there.
Thank you, Commissioner Randall. Well, the next question focuses more on the unique circumstances or issues that your individual states face. The question is basically, are there any unique circumstances or issues that you would like the market operators and the market participants to better understand as we work towards mitigating the impact of market seams that are unique to your state? And with this question, I will start with Commissioner Aguilera.
Thank you. Yeah, unique circumstances for New Mexico, absolutely. I think we're a very unique state from our culture and geography, and it's no different when it comes to where we stand with the regional markets and this discussion that we're having. So in New Mexico, we produce energy. We have a lot of natural resources for electric energy. We have a very large oil and gas industry. We're the third largest producer of energy in the country and produce 11 times more energy than we consume. And we want that to remain. And in addition to that, we're in a situation where the eastern part of New Mexico is an SPP proper. We have PNM, who is intending to join EDAM, and El Paso Electric, Market to Markets Plus, and then we also have a tiny sliver in northwestern New Mexico that is in the SPP Western expansion, and so we have all of it. So we are in the middle of this conversation as we see it, and so what is unique about that? To me, it's the same transmission that we're trying to, the same transmission issue that we're trying to transact across each other's territory and have limitations that we need to get right. And we need to have a clear understanding of how those firm transmission rights are going to work in each market. And that is important to us in New Mexico because we are seeking that value for our ratepayers that we were talking about. And the uncertainty around the transmission and the congestion costs, potential congestion costs, and how all of that is going to work is an unfortunate situation that we really have to solve, because we need to ensure that the resources that we are intending for a certain market can actually make it to those load centers. And so the transmission is really important to that. And the rules surrounding that are really important to us as well.
Thank you. Commissioner Hammond, do you have any thoughts that are unique for Idaho?
I don't know. You know, the state we're at right now, we have one utility that is selected a market, of course, PacifiCorp, Rocky Mountain Power, and we don't know yet what Avista or Idaho Power may do, and I know that they will make their determinations in a way that I'm sure will make sense for their customers, and we'll see that at some point in time. Unique for us, maybe. And I have to be careful here. I don't have anybody that's going to kick me under the table, like one of my staff, to be, you know, it's time. And there's no like curtain. So if Ann kicks me, you'll see it. But I think from my standpoint, unique circumstances, that one, like everybody, it's not necessarily unique. The load growth in Idaho is significant. We've never seen something like this, I think, that I can remember in the 25 years I've been involved. And so addressing those challenges is significant, and building to meet those challenges while addressing affordability concerns certainly is tough. I'd say secondarily, we may be politically different, and there are challenges sometimes, perspectives on how these markets benefit Idaho customers. And so we constantly are trying to educate, and we can do better that way, certainly, as a commission. But, you know, help us help the folks, you know, help us help you in that, you know, the more information, the more transparent, the more education you do. There are some people certainly that won't agree, but I think the more you do in our state, who always, or at least recently, seems to be suspicious of all sorts of things, the better. And I'm not saying we're off the rails. I'm not saying, but it is a challenge sometimes because the perspective doesn't often meet the reality and the facts. The more facts we get out to explain to folks why these things are good things and how they work well for customers, not for profits, the better. So it's just something we deal with quite often, and we get questions quite often about, well, this market is being made so XYZ utility can sell power out of state to make money, ignoring the fact that you have to serve your own load first, and that any sales on the market actually go to benefit customers. If they make profit on those sales, the utilities return those profits back to customers. And so why are the markets a good thing rather than a fear thing? Maybe that's it. There's a fear. So anyways, thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Hammond. Perhaps now, Commissioner Rendell, you can share some thoughts that are specific to this wonderful state of Washington that we're in.
Yes, well, in this fair state of Washington, hydro is very significant. We share the Columbia River with on the border with Oregon, and also very significantly connected with Idaho and with Montana with the hydro operations on the Snake River and the Columbia River. That makes up, depending on who you talk to, between 70 and 80% of the energy generation in the state. But the three electric utilities that the commission regulates out of the 64 utilities that operate in the state, just for complexity, one has already joined and is operating in EDAM. One has indicated its intent to join Markets Plus, and one is undecided. So with this fact of the two markets, and also highlighting the different regions of Markets Plus and the lack of connectivity to the southwest portion, it could essentially isolate some of the hydro in the northwest, which could be a benefit, but it could also make it harder to get the benefit of those sales from those utilities that are hydro rich. At the same time, as Commissioner Hammond mentioned, we're seeing significant demand, not in all parts of the state, but significant demand, and more importantly, a need for new resources and new transmission, because we have load centers that are isolated. We have limited connectivity, and there are constraints on Bonneville's system, which really connects most of the utilities in Washington. We are seeing the need for new resources and transmission to meet the demand, and also resource adequacy, because those of you who were here remember January 2025 was a significant event, and we need all the resources we can flowing easily across seams and market seams, because we have existing seams. We need to make sure that we address, and I have to say the two markets have worked hard to address Washington's specific greenhouse gas requirements in our cap and invest law. We are now linked with California and Quebec. And while both markets have included elements of greenhouse gas requirements in the market design that would allow Washington utilities to participate and comply, we need to think how those elements will be addressed in the seams, market seams discussion, which is not something that the East has done. And so it's kind of up to us to figure out how we do this in the West. So this adds another element to the need for those seams agreements, but I think more importantly in the data sharing, which is what a lot of the conversations in both the Greenhouse Gas Task Force and in the EDAM work on greenhouse gas was really about what information we need to share with one another. So when we do have those trades, that we can effectively report, and whether your state has a cap and trade or other requirements, that you're able to show as your utilities that they're complying with those rules. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Commissioner Rendell. There's a word I use a lot these days is tapestry, and sometimes I use mosaic when I think of all these things that we have to deal with in the West on a daily basis. We experience the complexity of the diversity that we live in. So thank you for sharing the uniqueness of your states, because it does reflect some of the unique characteristics. And I will note that the GHG element is an element that the expert panelists didn't pick up on. So kudos to you. The next question is on ensuring visibility. One of the important things that we have discussed is how can market operators ensure that state commissioners have visibility into the issues and efforts to mitigate the impacts of market seams And I know that you all have lots of experience of being on different committees, and I thought I'd get a little bit of insights from you all on how we could leverage some of the existing venues for ensuring we provide you insights and updates. And so I thought I'd start with Commissioner Hammond this time around.
I don't know how I got into this position, but I've often said, do I have a conflict because I serve on the Bosser and then I serve on MSC? So maybe that's a good thing that I get to see both sides and get an opportunity to go back and forth. I have colleagues, one who I've worked for a few years and worked with, former Commissioner Raper, who's always provided valuable advice and insight. And, you know, Holly and Stacy obviously have been very helpful in working with us. So we start from a good place in terms of visibility and transparency. I believe the intent is to really make this work and help guide us in those places or to that place of visibility and transparency. For us, it's a disadvantage a little bit because we don't, in order to follow, we don't have an expert necessarily, the commission right now on markets and seams. And so we're trying to develop that. And we don't have someone that's really participated in FERC proceedings heavily. That's where we would participate if we needed to make comments, of course, on any particular decision that's made. But I think for us, some of the things that have been discussed already, the sharing of data, the standardizing of terminology and language to make things easily understood. We don't have to go back and forth to a different list of acronyms. I mean, I keep advocating we have a BOSSer, a COSSer. We may need a MOSSer, a DOSSer. We need a couple others, but I think that's the problem. Keeping track of everything when you have different terminology is hard. It makes, you're not speaking the same language right at the beginning. I think there was an event recently in Wyoming that WEC wrote a report on that talked about some of the shortfalls, inadequate understanding between RCs and operators, incomplete modeling of neighboring systems, insufficient sharing of operational information, and so inadequate visibility across the seams. And so I think what I see again, we're in front of it, we're discussing these things we know could be issues, and we're trying to solve those issues in advance of this market operation happening for both in a large and sustainable manner. But that will depend in large part on if we're able to agree on that terminology, if we're able to agree on systems that allow not only the market participants and the markets to talk to each other in a meaningful way, but that the state regulators and their staffs, who are really the engine for us that drives everything, the experts that are on those staff, the engineers, the accountants, the economists, those are the folks that we really need to have visibility in that. And so I would encourage, as part of this process, that either we have a meeting where you invite state regulators from the West all across and have a workshop with potentially both markets, or or staff, having that staff there available so they know how these things operate in advance, and our staff is participating in learning about the solutions and maybe giving their ideas about what visibility looks like for them when they're auditing this matter. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Very, very helpful. And I will note that we're running out of acronyms. So those of you in this business, think about that very carefully, consolidating those acronyms. Next, I'll ask Commissioner Randall to share with us a little bit on how the we may ensure that the state commissioners have visibility into these issues.
So I'll echo Commissioner Hammond's comments, and particularly the staff, the need for staff to really understand these things. I would say similar to the issue that states raised and FERC addressed in its large load ANOPR 206 orders. that states need transparency into the costs of transmission and upgrades that large loads cause for the appropriate cost allocation in the states. A similar thing needs to happen here. States need visibility into the power costs that are going to result from these new markets. In our power cost filings, utilities file with commissions, the staff are going to need to know a breakdown of the costs for their own prudence review for what was congestion management, what were the costs for different at different interties, and where was the pancaking and what were the transmission costs. That's going to be really critical for us to identify this, and also a need for market monitors of both markets to weigh in the FERC filing, both on what the markets are going to file at the end of September, but also throughout the development of these SEAMS agreements, because those are very helpful for state commissioners to also get visibility into what's going on, access to the models that you're using for transmission planning and coordination. Because ultimately it comes down to, as I said before, it comes down to the fair, just, and reasonable rates. Yes, we need to keep the lights on, but as state commissioners, we also need to know what costs are being passed to customers. And in this day and age, it's, right now, it's not the economy stupid, it's the electric rate stupid. So let's remember that that is really top of mind for those of us sitting in our seats right now.
Thank you, Commissioner Rendell. I think that's a great segue actually to our next question. And our next question is focused on what is the role of regulators in the process of identifying and discussing the emerging market SEAMS issues, but more importantly, how these market SEAMS issues might affect the electricity customers, and really anticipating and identifying those before they affect electricity market customers. And I thought maybe on this one, since your mic is fresh, I'd start with you, Commissioner Rendell.
Thanks. And I do want to appreciate the efforts that both CAISO and SPP have made in bringing state commissioners and the staff in early and throughout this process through the BOSSR and the Markets Plus States Committee and the various task forces. I would say we were really busy for a long time on many committees. And so I think that conversation with the state commissioners and those participants in the markets has been really critical for us to understand what's going on, and also for folks to appreciate our perspective. And I think we need to continue that. Now, we don't have 205 rights in either of these markets, so I'll just recognize that, but that doesn't mean that the states are not going to be engaged in the various filings that are made. And, we still can be filing with FERC, and we can still be submitting comments with FERC collectively as our, BOSSers or individually. We are going to be considering the costs that utilities are spending on these efforts, and we need to make sure that it's working. If it's not working and costs are high, as I said before, this could be worse than what's happening in PJM right now. So we really need to remember how key it is. And I hate to invoke PJM, but I think we need to remember what this is all about. Again, this is about more efficiency, better benefits for customers and the utilities that are engaging in these efforts. So let's make sure we keep our eye on the prize. And the role of regulators, I think, is to make sure that we keep reminding you of that.
Well, Commissioner Hammond, maybe you have some thoughts on the role of the regulators in identifying those issues that might hit payers.
I was reading an article recently about regulatory capture, and maybe a weird segue, but the article itself by Scott Hempling brought up some key points that I think that are important here for what I need to do, what my role is. I can't speak for Ed or Dane, but if you have any questions about this, call them, okay? And I think for me, it's being proactive about this, learning as much as I can. We have to be at the table. I'm going to use something that Ed says. If you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And so I don't think that about this room, but it's a good point. We need to be involved. We have to have vision and priorities and have long-term thinking about how these solutions will work. We always have to keep in mind fairness, as we've talked about today. And then also, of course, remember our statutory duties, that we're to ensure just, fair, and reasonable rates and help maintain adequate service. Also, through the regulatory compact, make sure the utility is able to provide those things. We are not hamstringing them to the point where those things are damaged. So we have obviously an important role. We have another thing I think that I would love to do is provide clearer direction, clearer guidance on where our priorities are and how we communicate that with the folks in the room. I may have gone a little off topic here, but once there's a very famous person here in this room today, and I think what I keep coming back to is this quote or this statement this very famous person made, which was, "We are all each other's customers," and we need to remember that. Whatever market you're in, whatever system you're in, remember that we're all trying to do what's in the public interest. And at least for me, that's what I have to think about. But we're all trying to get to that, the things that Anne was talking about, the things that Gabe was talking about, value, efficiency, reliability. So thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Hammond. Well, Commissioner Aguilera, perhaps you have some thoughts on this question too.
Yeah, and so in terms of our role, I agree and want to build on what's already been said. One of the things that I think is important that has come out of this for me today is just making sure that we understand the impact, and not just generally, but the exact circumstances we're in. So kind of to the question that Vijay asked earlier about what the guidance to regulators, and one of the things that came out of those responses was have the transmission providers present how they're preparing, and then later how it's going. So understanding the actual impact of the congestion, of the rules that we need to put in place, and then how they're working once they are in place. And so that's part of our role, is to understand that. The other part of our role is to remind, and you just did this, but to remind ourselves here why we're doing this. And so that's for the customers. We've mentioned already about, we've been chasing these savings for customers, given that we have an affordability crisis, and seams are a barrier that could erode some of that value that we've been chasing. And so reminding ourselves why we're all doing this. It's for the people who are out there, because they need us to. I do want to address one other thing from the last panel, which is about priorities. And it was mentioned that reliability is a priority, and it absolutely is a priority. Customer savings is also a priority. And I see a difference between a reliable service at the lowest possible cost and serving customers at the lowest possible cost while providing reliable service. And you can, because there are different ways to achieve both of those. And I believe in all of you that we will end up with a reliable system. We can't let that be necessarily the driver, because it could be more expensive for customers. So we need to be thinking about the cost impact to customers. So I think that's also part of our role, is to remind us all of that.
Well, thank you. That's actually a really nice segue to the next question. I think I have some more time, right? 2 minutes? All right, quick round robin. All right, quick round robin. And you just had your turn, Commissioner Aguilera, because you just hit the mark on prioritization.
More.
You have more? All right. So how about 1 minute each? Tell us your thoughts. You heard a lot today about prioritization, what things to prioritize first. Reliability, always at the top of the list. We talked about that a lot. Equity, efficiency, import-export optimization. What would you say are the most important things? What's your reaction to the need to prioritize and how you would prioritize? Starting with you, Commissioner Aguilera.
That on the priorities, that is what I had. So I'll allow my colleagues, but in terms of guidance, I have more. So I'll go later after you.
I'm on. Remind me of the question. Could you repeat?
Well, we talked about what priorities.
Oh, what priorities?
Yes.
Well,
prioritization.
we're primarily, as most folks, in this side of the world, we're economic regulators. So as these two, cost, we're concerned about cost. We're always concerned about cost. And so I think Ann's point earlier about what we need to look at and what those costs are and how we can do that. I don't know that it could add anything more, but that is a priority, certainly. And reliability, of course, is important. And what do most people think about for power? It's, can I turn my light, I hit the switch, things work. But affordability is becoming increasingly important, as everyone knows. And other priorities, I think, for us are relationships. We have relationships with many folks across the spectrum as regulators. I value that. I value the opportunity we have to meet with you as well. So, thank you.
Thank you. Well,
So I really appreciated the comments of the earlier speakers. I think the mic drop for me from Bob Dawson was that the concern is that even with the examples of JOAs we have from the East, they're not working. So it's like, okay, well then how do we go from there? How do we make sure it works? This priority of reliability, efficiency, fairness is really key, because if you don't have the lights on, then it doesn't matter how much it costs. But affordability is really key. So the prioritization is correct. But I think one of the things we need to also focus on is that on grid optimization. We know that we're not optimizing the grid now as good as we can. And so how do we make sure with the SEAMs that we're not creating further barriers to optimizing that grid better to get the most value out of this amazing machine that we have?
thank you so much. My colleagues are telling me to roll on, but I'm going to give you each a quick opportunity for final thoughts. Commissioner Aguilera, you first.
Okay, so thank you. In terms of priorities, I already said, as you're thinking of solutions, think about the cost to the customers. And another thing that I have written down here, which Commissioner Rendell already said, is about market monitors, but I want to say it again to emphasize is that they need to be involved as well. And responding to also comments on FERC's recent order, but being a part of this conversation as well. That's one thing that we didn't highlight very much yet in this, but market power and the exercise of market power could also be a concern here. So from that and from an economic efficiency perspective, we need to include them. The firm rights that we have on each other's system, we need to understand that the SEAMS rules that we develop around those need to be fair for everybody. I could see a world where we begin installing rules that are better for one transmission provider and leaves other people hanging, but there's reciprocity there. It works both ways. And so we need to think carefully about how we design those rules and respect each other's rights. The other thing that I wanted to mention is don't be afraid to change the system, improve it. Transmission, because earlier there was an example of MDU receiving $42 million worth of congestion. That's a financial transaction that is going to somebody. Why can't another solution could be to think about how we could use that money to upgrade the system so that there is not as much congestion. And the direction we're in right now, we don't have transmission planning in the markets. And so think about how those price signals are going to be created so that, again, we make sure that we're doing what is best for customers from an economic perspective. That's all I had. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Hammond.
Thank you. Turned my mic off. That was probably the right choice. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I walk away from meetings like this feeling inspired. I've learned things. I've met new folks, and I have faith that there are so many brilliant people in these places that are going to solve hard problems. And I would encourage you to keep working that way. Otherwise, you'll have very unhappy regulators, and that's never good.
Commissioner Randall. And I'll echo both of my colleagues' comments. Thank you so much for being here, for giving us the opportunity to have a voice. Appreciate that. And I'll let you all go to lunch.
Well, thank you very much to the commissioners. Welcome me and thanking them all. All right.
Thank you, Anna. A big thank you to you and all the panelists for that excellent discussion. Next, I believe Anna has a couple closing thoughts before we close out today's meeting.
I recognize my closing thoughts stand between your lunch. Thank you again, Seattle City and Light, for hosting us here in Seattle City Hall. And thank you to each of you for taking the time to join us, both in person and online. Your participation reflects the importance of this conversation, and it's truly appreciated by us all. And it's a shared commitment across the West. I think you heard that today in the room. We have a shared commitment across the West to really work on these issues cooperatively and together. And we really welcome those opportunities and these challenges and hope that we can continue the dialogue in a productive way as we address these for the West. Thank you. I also wanted to note and invite you to submit comments and provide feedback on the workshop. And that's our goal there is to inform future workshops. We are requesting written comments by August 14th, so it's a deadline. That will help us for the next upcoming meetings, so please do so. There is a common template that is available on the meeting page, along with instructions on how to submit those. The California ISO has actually scheduled the next meeting for August 18th. It'll be a hybrid meeting again. The workshop is going to be from 9 a.m. to 2:30 p.m., a little bit longer than today, Mountain Time. And it will be with in-person attendance at the Western Electricity Coordination Council, WEC. Be at their offices in Salt Lake City. The link for registration is also available on the ISO's meeting page. I encourage you to go soon. Make sure you get your spot. In closing, I would like to say that SEAMS discussions are both highly technical and commercially important. And the next steps on in the workshops, the next topic for our workshops will be focused on congestion management. And that is, as we heard earlier today, an example of the complexity of the market SEAMS that we think we need to focus on in our next series. The workshops are really intended to get more technical and detailed as they progress. We thought today's workshop did a nice job. Well, I think it did a nice job in setting the stage and thinking about the issues that have to be addressed, but we're going to roll up our sleeves and get a little bit more technical. The ISO's goal is to lay the groundwork for SEAMS discussions for participants across the West by bringing the experts to the discussion, both the physics, the engineers, the economics, the market rules, they all interact together. I'm sorry, Bob, you're going to have to learn a little bit about the physics. The next two workshops relate to questions that the ISO and the SPP are directed to address in the joint report to FERC. The report is an important mechanism and opportunity for both CAISO and SPP to document the work already underway. And it's an opportunity to identify the highest priority SEAMS issues and establish that roadmap that we are going to have to undertake. So that's going to be the next focus of our meetings. We weren't anticipating the order when we started the discussions around the seams, but it's a good opportunity for us to coalesce around that and provide that report to the commission in a timely manner. I also wanted to note that the ISO is committed to working with SPP and the diverse group of interested parties in the West on market seams issues. And we really truly appreciate SPP's presence here today. And we are looking forward to SPP's contributions to this discussion in the upcoming workshops. And with that, it ends today's workshops. I want to say again, thank you everyone for participating and safe travels.
Thank you, Anna.
Thank you, Anna. A big thank you to all of our speakers today. And if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to us at isostakeholderaffairs@kaiso.com. With that, we'd like to thank you all for joining today's workshop, and a big thank you to everyone at Seattle City Light for helping us host today's workshop. As a reminder, this meeting was recorded for informational and convenience purposes only. The video file will be posted on the SEAMS webpage. Thank you and have a great rest of your day.